Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? The town of Millhaven had always been the kind of place where nothing much happened, and that was exactly how its residents preferred it. Nestled between rolling hills and bordered by the gentle curves of the Clearwater River, the town had maintained its quiet rhythm for nearly a century and a half. The main street stretched for exactly 12 blocks, lined with maple trees that had been planted in 1952 as part of a civic beautification project that the town council still talked about with pride. On most mornings, the sun would rise over the eastern hills and cast long shadows across the weathered brick buildings that housed Peterson's Hardware, Miller's Grocery, and the Millhaven Diner, where coffee had been brewing at 5:30 sharp every morning for the past 40 years. The streetlights would click off automatically at dawn, leaving the town to wake naturally with the light filtering through lace, curtains and Venetian blinds in houses that had sheltered the same families for generations. The police station occupied a modest building on Oak Street, just 2 blocks from the town square, where a bronze statue of the town's founder, Samuel Millhaven, stood surrounded by carefully maintained flower beds that bloomed in seasonal succession. The station itself had been built in 1967, replacing the original constable's office that had served the community since its incorporation. Inside, the walls were painted in a calming shade of sage green, and the floors were covered with linoleum tiles that had been installed during a renovation in the early 1980s. Police Chief Margaret Thornfield had held her position for 17 years, having taken over from Chief Ronald Matthews when he retired to spend more time with his grandchildren. Chief Thornfield was known throughout Millhaven for her methodical approach to law enforcement and her ability to resolve disputes with patience and understanding rather than authority and force. Her office, located at the back of the station, overlooked a small parking area where 3 patrol cars sat in neat rows, their white and blue paint gleaming even on overcast days. The daily routine at the Millhaven Police Department followed a pattern that had been established years ago and rarely required alteration. Officer David Chun would arrive first, usually around 6:15 in the morning, to review any overnight reports that might have come in through the answering service. These reports were typically minor incidents involving loose dogs, noise complaints from the occasional late-night gathering, or requests for welfare checks on elderly residents whose relatives lived in neighboring towns. Officer Sarah Martinez would arrive by 7 o'clock, followed by Officer James Woolworth, who had recently celebrated his 5th anniversary with the department. Together, they would review the day's assignments, which might include routine patrols through the residential neighborhoods, visits to the elementary and high schools, and periodic checks on the businesses along Main Street. The work was steady and predictable, involving more community interaction than actual law enforcement, which suited everyone perfectly. The town's emergency calls were rare and usually involved minor accidents, medical emergencies that required coordination with the volunteer ambulance service, or the occasional domestic dispute that could be resolved through careful mediation. The officers knew every family in town, understood the dynamics of long-standing neighborhood relationships, and had developed an intuitive sense of when a situation required official intervention versus a friendly conversation and perhaps a cup of coffee. On the morning of October 15th, Officer Chun arrived at his usual time to find that the overnight answering service had recorded 3 separate calls, all reporting the same unusual occurrence. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who lived on Elm Street in a house she had inherited from her parents, had called at 11:47 the previous evening to report that someone had been walking through her backyard repeatedly. But when she looked outside, no one was visible. The second call had come from Mr. Harold Finch, whose property adjoined Mrs. Vasquez's along the rear fence line. Mr. Finch had called at 12:23 in the morning to report that he had heard footsteps in his garden, clear and distinct footsteps that seemed to follow the path from his back door to the tool shed where he kept his lawn equipment and seasonal decorations. When he had turned on the exterior lights and looked outside, he had seen nothing unusual, but the sound had continued for several more minutes. The third call had been placed by Mrs. Dorothy Keller, who lived directly across the alley from both. Mrs. Vasquez and Mr. Finch, Mrs. Keller, had called at 1:15 in the morning to report that she had been awakened by what sounded like someone moving through the narrow space between the houses, but when she had gotten out of bed to investigate, the alley appeared empty under the glow of the streetlight that illuminated the intersection of Elm Street and Maple Alley. Officer Chen made careful notes about each call, recording the times, the names of the callers, and the specific details that each person had provided. The reports were unusual not because they involved potential trespassing, which did occur occasionally in Mill Haven, but because 3 separate residents had experienced very similar disturbances within the span of approximately 90 minutes, all in the same general area of town. When Chief Thornfield arrived at 8:30, Officer Chun presented her with the overnight reports and suggested that it might be appropriate to conduct a daylight examination of the area where the disturbances had been reported. Chief Thornfield agreed that this would be a reasonable precaution, though she noted that the incidents might have involved a lost pet, a person taking a shortcut through the neighborhood, or even the same individual passing through the area multiple times for perfectly innocent reasons. The neighborhood in question was one of the older sections of Mill Haven, where the houses had been built in the 1920s and 1930s during a period of modest expansion when the town had briefly served as a regional center for agricultural commerce. The homes were modest but well maintained, with small front yards and longer back gardens that extended toward the alley system that had been designed to provide access for waste collection and utility maintenance. Elm Street itself was lined with mature elm trees that had somehow survived the Dutch elm disease outbreaks of previous decades, their branches forming a natural canopy that provided shade during the summer months and allowed filtered sunlight to reach the sidewalks and front porches below. The street was paved with asphalt that had been resurfaced periodically over the years, and the curbing was made of concrete that showed the weathered effects of many seasons of freezing and thawing. The houses along Elm Street reflected the architectural styles popular during the era of their construction, with front porches supported by wooden columns, dormer windows that provided light to second-floor bedrooms, and small decorative details that spoke to the craftsmanship of local builders who had taken pride in their work. Many of the homes featured gardens that had been tended by successive generations of residents, with flower beds that bloomed in carefully planned sequences and vegetable plots that provided fresh produce during the growing season. Mrs. Vasquez's house, located at 247 Elm Street, was a 2-story structure with white clapboard siding and dark green shutters that framed windows adorned with flower boxes containing seasonal plantings. The front yard was enclosed by a low fence made of wrought iron that had been painted and repainted numerous times over the decades, and a brick walkway led from the sidewalk to the front steps, which were flanked by 2 large ceramic planters that Mrs. Vasquez filled with different flowers throughout the year. The backyard extended approximately 60 feet from the rear of the house to the alley, and was divided into several distinct areas, including a small patio made of flagstone, a lawn area bordered by flower beds, and a vegetable garden that Mrs. Vasquez had maintained since moving into the house following her marriage 32 years earlier. A wooden privacy fence, painted the same dark green as the shutters, separated her property from the neighboring yards on either side. Mr. Finch's property, at 249 Elm Street, was similar in size and layout, though his house was constructed of red brick with white trimmer on the windows and doors. His backyard featured a larger lawn area and a detached garage that opened onto the alley, along with the tool shed that he had mentioned in his call to the police station. The shed was located near the rear fence line, positioned in a corner of the yard where it was partially concealed by a mature lilac bush that bloomed magnificently each spring. Mrs. Keller's house, located at 248 Elm Street on the opposite side of the alley, faced the rear yards of both Mrs. Vasquez and Mr. Finch across the narrow paved lane that served the entire block. Her house was built in a similar style to the others, though it featured a distinctive bay window on the second floor that provided an excellent view of the alley and the neighboring properties. Mrs. Keller had often mentioned to her friends that this window made her feel like an unofficial guardian of the neighborhood, able to keep track of the daily activities and ensure that everything remained peaceful and secure. Chief Thornfield and Officer Chun arrived in the neighborhood at approximately 9:15 in the morning, parking their patrol car on Elm Street near Mrs. Vasquez's house. The morning was clear and cool, with a light breeze stirring the leaves that had begun to change color with the arrival of autumn. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from chimneys where residents had begun lighting their first fires of the season, mixed with the earthy smell of fallen leaves that had started to accumulate along the curbs and in the corners of yards. They began their examination by walking through Mrs. Vasquez's backyard, following the path that led from her back door to the rear fence line. The ground was slightly damp from dew that had not yet evaporated in the shade cast by the neighboring houses, and their footsteps left faint impressions in the soft earth of the flower beds that bordered the flagstone patio. Chief Thornfield noted that the grass showed no obvious signs of disturbance, though she acknowledged that determining whether someone had walked across the lawn would be difficult given the normal patterns of use by Mrs. Vasquez herself. Near the rear fence, where the property adjoined Mr. Finch's yard, they discovered a small section where the grass appeared to have been compressed, as if someone had stood in that location for an extended period of time. The area was approximately 2 feet in diameter, located just beside the gate that Mrs. Vasquez used to access the alley for garbage collection. Officer Chun photographed the area from several angles, though both officers recognized that the compressed grass might have resulted from any number of innocent activities. They proceeded to examine Mr. Finch's property, following the path from his back door to the tool shed that he had mentioned in his report. The path was made of gravel that had been laid over a foundation of packed earth, and it showed no clear footprints or other signs of recent use by anyone other than Mr. Finch himself. However, near the tool shed, they found that the ground beneath one of the windows was disturbed, with small stones scattered in a pattern that suggested someone might have approached the building and possibly looked inside. The tool shed itself was a modest structure, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with wooden siding that had been stained brown many years earlier and was now weathered to a soft gray color. The door was secured with a padlock that showed no signs of tampering, and the windows were covered with screening that prevented easy viewing of them. Interior. Mr. Finch had explained that he kept lawn equipment, garden tools, and seasonal decorations in the shed, along with various household items that he preferred not to store in his basement or garage. The examination of Mrs. Keller's property provided additional information that began to suggest a pattern to the previous night's activities. From her bay window, which faced directly onto the alley, there was a clear view of both Mrs. Vasquez's and Mr. Finch's backyards, as well as the rear entrances to several other houses on the block. Mrs. Keller had positioned a comfortable chair near the window, along with a small table that held a reading lamp and usually a book or magazine, creating a cozy spot where she often spent her evenings. Chief Thornfield and Officer Chun walked through the alley itself, examining the pavement and the narrow strips of grass that grew along the edges where the asphalt met the fencing and property lines. The alley was approximately 12 feet wide, providing enough space for garbage trucks and utility vehicles to navigate, but narrow enough that any activity would be easily visible from the surrounding houses. Streetlights were positioned at regular intervals, casting pools of illumination that would make it difficult for someone to move through the area undetected during the nighttime. Hours at approximately 10:30. The officers decided to interview the 3 residents who had reported the disturbances, beginning with Mrs. Vasquez, who invited them into her kitchen for coffee. and homemade cookies that she had baked the previous afternoon. Mrs. Vasquez was a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in the house since her marriage, and she was known throughout the neighborhood for her detailed knowledge of local activities and her willingness to help whenever assistance was needed. Mrs. Vasquez explained that she had been reading in her living room when she first heard what sounded like footsteps in her backyard. The sound had been distinct and rhythmic, like someone walking deliberately along the path from the back door toward the rear of the property. She had turned off the television and listened carefully, confirming that the sounds were continuing at regular intervals. When she had looked outside through the kitchen window, she had seen nothing unusual, but the footsteps had continued for what she estimated to be another 5 or 10 minutes. The peculiar aspect of her experience, Mrs. Vasquez explained, was that the footsteps had seemed to follow the same route repeatedly, as if someone was walking back and forth along the path rather than simply passing through her yard. She had considered turning on the exterior lights, but had decided against it because she was uncertain whether doing so might startle whoever was outside or potentially escalate what might be an innocent situation. Mr. Finch, who met with the officers in his garage while he organized tools for a weekend project, provided a similar account of his experience. He had been watching television in his den when he heard footsteps outside, and like Mrs. Vasquez, he had found the sounds to be clear and deliberate rather than hurried or furtive. The footsteps had seemed to originate near his back door and proceed along the gravel path toward the tool shed, then return toward the house before repeating the same route. What had concerned Mr. Finch most was that the footsteps had continued even after he had turned on the exterior lights that illuminated his backyard. He had expected that anyone passing through the area would either announce themselves or quickly move on once the lights revealed their presence, but instead, the footsteps had continued for several more minutes before finally stopping. He had remained awake for nearly an hour afterward, listening for any additional sounds, but the remainder of the night had been quiet. Mrs. Keller received the officers in her living room, where the bay window provided the view of the alley that had made her an inadvertent witness to the night's unusual activities. She explained that she had been awakened by sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions, as if someone was moving through the narrow spaces between the houses rather than walking along the established pathways or through the alley itself. From her window, Mrs. Keller had been able to see portions of both neighboring properties, and she had noticed that lights had been turned on in both Mr. Finch's and Mrs. Vasquez's houses at different times during the night. However, she had not seen any person moving through the area, despite the clear sounds of footsteps that had continued intermittently for what she estimated to be nearly 30 minutes. Most intriguing aspect of Mrs. Keller's account was her observation that the sounds had seemed to move in a pattern that suggested someone was familiar with the neighborhood layout, rather than the random or exploratory movements that might be expected from someone who was lost or disoriented. The footsteps had followed what appeared to be deliberate routes between specific locations, as if the person had a particular destination or purpose in mind. By noon, Chief Thornfield and Officer Chun had completed their initial investigation of the reported disturbances. They had examined the physical evidence, interviewed the 3 residents who had made reports, and walked through the entire neighborhood to develop a comprehensive understanding of the area's layout and normal patterns of activity. While they had found some evidence that supported the residents' accounts, nothing they had discovered suggested any criminal activity or immediate threat to public safety. Chief Thornfield made the decision to increase patrol frequency in the Elm Street neighborhood for the following week, with officers making additional passes through the area during the evening and overnight hours. She also asked Officer Chun to prepare a detailed report documenting their findings, including the photographs he had taken and the statements provided by the 3 residents. The report would be filed in the department's active case system, where it could be easily referenced if additional similar incidents were reported. The afternoon brought no additional calls related to the previous night's disturbances. and the regular business of the police department continued according to its normal rhythm. Officer Martinez responded to a minor traffic accident at the intersection of Main Street and Cedar Avenue, where a delivery truck had scraped the side of a parked car while making a turn. The incident was resolved through the exchange of insurance information and did not require any citations or formal charges. Officer Woolworth conducted his scheduled visit to the high school, where he met with the principal to discuss preparations for the upcoming homecoming celebration. The annual event traditionally drew visitors from throughout the region and required coordination between the police department, the fire department, and the volunteer organizations that managed traffic and parking during the festivities. As the day progressed, Chief Thornfield found herself returning frequently to the reports from Elm Street, reviewing the details and considering various explanations for what the residents had experienced. The consistency of the accounts was noteworthy, particularly given that the three individuals had reported similar phenomena without having communicated with each other prior to calling the police station. The timing of the incidents also suggested a coordinated series of events rather than random occurrences. Possibility that the disturbances had involved a lost or disoriented person seemed unlikely given Mrs. Keller's observation about the deliberate nature of the movement patterns. Similarly, the extended duration of the activities made it improbable that they had involved someone simply taking a shortcut through the neighborhood. The fact that the footsteps had continued even after exterior lights had been turned on suggested that whoever was responsible was not particularly concerned about being detected. Chief Thornfield also considered the possibility that the incidents had involved someone conducting surveillance of the neighborhood, perhaps as preparation for future criminal activity. However, this explanation seemed inconsistent with the repetitive nature of the movements and the focus on areas that would provide little useful information for someone planning a burglary or other property crime. As the afternoon turned toward evening, Chief Thornfield decided to personally conduct the first additional patrol of the Elm Street neighborhood. She left the station at approximately 6:30, driving slowly through the residential streets and observing the normal patterns of activity as residents returned home from work, prepared dinner, and began their evening routines. The neighborhood appeared entirely peaceful, with lights beginning to appear in windows and the occasional sound of children playing in backyards before being called inside for the night. She parked her patrol car at the intersection of Elm Street and Maple Alley, positioning it so that she had a clear view of the rear portions of the properties where the previous night's disturbances had been reported. The streetlight at the intersection provided adequate illumination for her to monitor the area while remaining visible to any residents who might be reassured by the police presence. During the first hour of her observation, Chief Thornfield noted the routine activities that characterized early evening in this part of town. Mrs. Vasquez turned on her kitchen lights and could be seen moving about as she prepared her dinner. Mr. Finch emerged from his house to retrieve his mail and spent several minutes examining his flower beds, deadheading roses and checking for signs of frost damage that might require protective covering. Mrs. Keller appeared at her bay window periodically, and Chief Thornfield could see that she was keeping her own informal watch over the neighborhood. Several other residents walked their dogs along the sidewalks, following routes that had become familiar through years of repetition. The evening was quiet and uneventful, exactly as Chief Thornfield had expected it to be. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Chief Thornfield continued her observation, noting the gradual transition from the active period of early evening to the quieter hours, when most residents moved their activities indoors. Exterior lights were turned on at regular intervals, creating pools of visibility around back doors and garage entrances. The streetlights along Elm Street and in the alley provided consistent illumination that would make any unauthorized activity easily detectable. By 9 o'clock, the neighborhood had settled into its typical nighttime rhythm. Television screens flickered behind curtained windows, and the occasional sound of voices or music drifted from houses where families were spending quiet evenings together. Chief Thornfield had observed nothing unusual during her surveillance, but she decided to remain in position for another 2 hours to ensure that she would be present during the time period when the previous night's disturbances had occurred. The quiet hours between 9 and 11 o'clock passed without incident, marked only by the routine activities of residents preparing for bed and the occasional passage of vehicles along the main streets that bordered the neighborhood. Chief Thornfield used the time to review the details of the previous night's reports, considering various theories and planning additional steps that might be taken if similar incidents occurred again. At approximately 10:45, Chief Thornfield noticed that Mrs. Keller had turned off the lights in her bay window area, presumably retiring for the evening. Mr. Finch's house had been dark since shortly after 10 o'clock, and Mrs. Vasquez had turned off her kitchen lights around 9:30, though a dim glow from her living room suggested that she might still be reading or watching television. The neighborhood had reached the quiet state that typically characterized the late evening hours in Millhaven, when most residents had settled in for the night and the streets became the domain of late shift workers, dog walkers taking their pets out for final visits, and the occasional teenager returning home after spending the evening with friends. Chief Thornfield had observed this peaceful transition countless times during her years of service, and she found it one of the most satisfying aspects of working in a small town where such routines could be maintained and protected. At exactly 11:27, Chief Thornfield heard the sound that Mrs. Vasquez had described in her report to the overnight answering service. Footsteps, clear and deliberate, seemed to originate from somewhere near the rear of Mrs. Vasquez's property and proceed along what appeared to be the path leading toward the back fence. The sound was distinct against the quiet background of the sleeping neighborhood, and Chief Thornfield immediately turned her attention toward the area where the footsteps seemed to be occurring. From her position in the patrol car, Chief Thornfield had a partial view of Mrs. Vasquez's backyard, but the angle and the shadows cast by the neighboring houses made it impossible to see clearly into the area where the sounds appeared to be coming from. She quietly exited her vehicle and began walking toward the entrance to Maple Alley, where she would have a better perspective on the rear portions of the properties in question. As she moved closer to the alley, the footsteps continued at regular intervals, maintaining the steady rhythm that the residents had described in their reports. The sound seemed to follow a specific route, beginning near one location and proceeding to another before returning along the same path. Chief Thornfield estimated that each complete cycle of the movement pattern took approximately 2 minutes, and the footsteps continued with mechanical regularity. Positioning herself near the streetlight at the entrance to the alley, Chief Thornfield was able to observe the rear portions of all 3 properties where disturbances had been reported the previous night. The exterior lights at Mr. Finch's house were off, but sufficient illumination from the streetlights made it possible to see across the lawns and gardens. Despite the clear sound of footsteps continuing in the area, Chief Thornfield could see no movement, no shadows, and no indication of any person present in the yards. The sounds continued for approximately 15 minutes, maintaining the same pattern and rhythm that had been described in the previous night's reports. During this time, Chief Thornfield moved to several different positions around the perimeter of the area, attempting to locate the source of the footsteps and determine whether they might be caused by something other than a person walking through the neighborhood. From each observation point, the sounds remained clear and distinct, but no visual evidence of their cause could be detected. At approximately 11:45, the footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had begun. Chief Thornfield waited in position for another 30 minutes, listening carefully for any resumption of the sounds or other unusual activity. The neighborhood returned to its normal quiet state, with only the distant sound of traffic on the main roads and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the stillness of the night. Chief Thornfield returned to her patrol car and made Detailed notes about her observations, recording the time when the footsteps had begun, the duration of the activity, and the pattern that the sounds had seemed to follow. She also noted the weather conditions, which were similar to those of the previous night, and the fact that no visual evidence had accompanied the auditory phenomena she had experienced. The remainder of the night passed quietly, with no additional reports of unusual activity and no repetition of the footsteps that Chief Thornfield had heard during her surveillance. She concluded her extended patrol at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning and returned to the station to complete her report and prepare for the normal activities of the following day. The experience had provided Chief Thornfield with first-hand confirmation of the residents' accounts, while also presenting new questions about the nature and cause of the disturbances. The fact that the footsteps had been clearly audible without any corresponding visual evidence suggested either an unusual acoustic phenomena, something more complex than simple trespassing by an unauthorized person. Chief Thornfield decided that the investigation would require additional resources and a more systematic approach to determine whether the Elm Street disturbances represented an isolated occurrence or the beginning of a pattern that might affect other areas of Millhaven. She made plans to expand the scope of the inquiry and to consult with colleagues in neighboring jurisdictions who might have encountered similar unexplained phenomena. As the first light of dawn appeared over the eastern hills, Chief Thornfield reflected on the peaceful town she had served for so many years and the responsibility she felt to ensure that Millhaven remained a place where residents could feel safe and secure in their homes. The mysterious footsteps of Elm Street represented the first truly unusual case she had encountered in her career, and she was determined to approach it with the same methodical care and attention to detail that had served her well in all her previous police work. Investigation was just beginning, and Chief Thornfield knew that understanding what was happening in the quiet neighborhood would require patience, careful observation, and an open mind about possibilities that might not have obvious explanations. She looked forward to the challenge of solving a mystery that was unlike anything Millhaven had experienced before, while maintaining the calm and steady approach that had always been the hallmark of law enforcement in their peaceful community. Morning after Chief Thornfield's surveillance of Elm Street brought the familiar routine that had governed Millhaven for decades. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary activities, a subtle current of awareness flowed through the community. Word of the unusual disturbances had begun to circulate in the gentle way that news traveled in small towns, passed along during chance encounters at the post office, shared over coffee at the Millhaven diner, and discussed in the quiet conversations that took place while neighbors tended their gardens or walked their dogs along tree-lined streets. Officer Chun arrived at the station that morning to find Chief Thornfield already at her desk, reviewing the detailed report she had prepared about her nighttime observations. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting familiar patterns across the linoleum floor and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air above the filing cabinets that contained decades of carefully organized records. The coffee pot in the small kitchen area had been brewing since 6 o'clock, filling the building with the rich aroma that had become synonymous with the beginning of each workday. The daily briefing that morning included a discussion of the Elm Street incidents, though Chief Thornfield was careful to present the information in a way that would not cause undue alarm among the officers or lead to speculation that might find its way into the broader community. She explained that they were investigating reports of possible trespassing in the residential area and that increased patrols would continue until they could determine whether the incidents represented an ongoing concern or isolated occurrences that required no further action. Officer Martinez arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, carrying the newspaper that she picked up each morning from the stand outside Peterson's Hardware. The Millhaven Weekly Herald was published every Wednesday and contained local news, announcements of community events, and advertisements for the businesses that formed the economic foundation of the town. The paper served as both an information source and a social connector, keeping residents informed about activities and developments that affected their daily lives. The lead story in that week's edition focused on preparations for the annual Harvest Festival, scheduled to take place in the town square during the last weekend of October. The festival had been a Millhaven tradition for over 60 years, featuring local craftspeople, musicians, and food vendors, along with activities for children and families. The event drew visitors from throughout the region and represented one of the highlights of the community's social calendar. Officer Woolworth's arrival completed the morning shift lineup, and the three officers reviewed their assignments for the day while Chief Thornfield prepared to make her rounds through the community. These rounds were not officially required, but Chief Thornfield had maintained them throughout her tenure as a way of staying connected with residents and business owners, ensuring that the police department remained visible and accessible to everyone who called Millhaven home. The first stop on Chief Thornfield's regular route was Miller's Grocery, where she often encountered residents doing their morning shopping and could gauge the general mood and concerns of the community. The grocery store had been owned by the Miller family for 3 generations, and the current proprietor, Robert Miller, had taken over the business from his father 15 years earlier. The store occupied a corner building on Main Street, with large windows that provided natural light for the aisles, lined with carefully organized merchandise dotted inside Miller's Grocery. The morning routine followed patterns that had been established years ago and refined through daily repetition. Mrs. Patricia Collins, who worked part-time managing the checkout counter, would arrive at 7:30 to prepare the register and arrange the small items that customers frequently purchased on impulse. The delivery truck from the regional distributor would arrive at 8 o'clock, bringing fresh produce, dairy products, and other perishables that needed to be quickly processed and displayed. Robert Miller himself typically spent the early morning hours in the small office behind the customer service counter, reviewing invoices, updating inventory records, and preparing the daily bank deposit that would be taken to First National Bank during the afternoon. The office walls were covered with schedules, supplier catalogs, and photographs that documented the store's history and its role in the community's development. When Chief Thornfield entered the store that morning, she found Robert arranging a display of seasonal decorations that would appeal to residents preparing for Halloween and the approaching holiday season. The decorations included artificial autumn leaves, small pumpkins grown by local farmers, and wreaths made by members of the Millhaven Garden Club. The display represented the kind of community collaboration that characterized many aspects of life in the town. Their conversation began with the usual topics that occupied Robert's attention as a business owner: the upcoming Harvest Festival, changes in supplier prices that might affect the cost of groceries, and the condition of the parking area behind the store that needed repair before winter weather made the potholes more problematic. Chief Thornfield listened with the practiced attention of someone who understood that these daily concerns were the foundation upon which community stability was built. Robert mentioned that several customers had asked him about increased police activity in the residential neighborhoods, particularly around Elm Street and the surrounding areas. The questions had been casual rather than worried, reflecting the curiosity that naturally arose when residents noticed changes in familiar routines. Chief Thornfield explained that the police department was conducting additional patrols as part of their regular community safety initiatives, without providing specific details about the unusual reports they were investigating. The morning progressed with Chief Thornfield visiting other businesses along Main Street, including Peterson's Hardware, where she spoke with the owner about preparations for winter weather and the seasonal increase in demand for snow shovels, ice melt, and other cold weather supplies. Peterson's Hardware had served the community for over 40 years, and its owner, William Peterson, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the tools, supplies, and equipment that residents needed to maintain their homes and properties. The hardware store occupied a narrow building with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. The aisles were packed efficiently with merchandise organized according to a system that William Peterson had developed over decades of experience. Regular customers knew exactly where to find what they needed, while newcomers could rely on William's patient guidance to locate items and receive advice about home improvement projects. During her visit to Peterson's Hardware, Chief Thornfield encountered Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who was purchasing weather stripping for her windows in preparation for the colder months ahead. Mrs. Vasquez appeared calm and composed, showing no signs of distress about the events she had reported 2 nights earlier. Their conversation remained focused on practical matters related to home maintenance, though Chief Thornfield noted that Mrs. Vasquez seemed particularly interested in products that might improve the security of doors and windows. The mid-morning visit to the Millhaven Diner provided Chief Thornfield with another opportunity to observe the community's daily rhythms and assess residents' general state of mind. The diner served as an informal gathering place where people from different neighborhoods and walks of life encountered each other over coffee, breakfast, and the daily special that had been a tradition since the restaurant opened in the early 1970s. The diner's interior featured red vinyl booths along the windows facing Main Street, a counter with swivel stools that provided seating for individual diners, and walls decorated with photographs documenting Millhaven's history and development. The staff had remained remarkably stable over the years, with several waitresses having worked there for more than a decade, creating relationships with regular customers that went beyond simple service transactions. Margaret Henley, who had managed the diner's morning shift for 8 years, greeted Chief Thornfield with the familiarity of someone who had served her coffee and breakfast countless times. The morning crowd included several retirees who gathered daily to discuss current events, weather conditions, and local developments, along with workers stopping for quick meals before beginning their shifts at various businesses and organizations throughout the town. The conversation at the diner that morning included the usual topics that occupied residents' attention during the autumn season: preparations for winter weather, plans for holiday celebrations, and discussions about local high school sports teams whose performances were followed with passionate interest by supporters throughout the community. Chief Thornfield listened to these conversations while eating her breakfast, noting that the atmosphere remained relaxed and positive despite the unusual incidents that were occupying her professional attention. Following her breakfast at the diner, Chief Thornfield returned to the station to review the reports that had accumulated during her absence and to coordinate with the officers who were conducting their regular patrols throughout the community. Officer Chun had completed a thorough examination of the records related to previous incidents in the Elm Street neighborhood, searching for any patterns or connections that might provide insight into the current situation. The record search had revealed that the residential area around Elm Street had experienced very few police incidents over the past several years. The most recent report involved a complaint about a barking dog that had been resolved through a friendly conversation between neighbors. Prior to that, the only incidents had involved minor traffic violations, requests for welfare checks on elderly residents, and one report of a suspicious vehicle that had turned out to be a visiting relative who was unfamiliar with the neighborhood's parking regulations. Officer Martinez had spent her morning conducting routine patrols through the school zones and residential neighborhoods, paying particular attention to areas where children walked to and from school. Her observations had revealed nothing unusual, though she had made note of several minor maintenance issues that would require attention from the city's public works department. A streetlight that appeared to be malfunctioning, a stop sign that had been partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, and a section of sidewalk that had been damaged by tree roots and posed a potential hazard for pedestrians. Officer Woolworth had focused his patrol activities on the commercial district, visiting businesses and checking on properties that were temporarily unoccupied due to vacation schedules or other circumstances. His report included routine observations about normal business activities, along with a note that the parking meter on the way corner of Main Street and Oak Street had been damaged by an unknown vehicle and would need repair or replacement. The afternoon brought the regular administrative activities that occupied much of Chief Thornfield's time, reviewing budget reports, updating training records for the department's officers, and responding to correspondence from county and state law enforcement agencies. These tasks, while not directly related to active investigations, were essential for maintaining the professional standards and operational effectiveness that residents of Millhaven had come to expect from their police department. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Chief Thornfield received a phone call from Mrs. Dorothy Keller, who requested a brief meeting to discuss additional observations she had made about the Elm Street disturbances. Mrs. Keller explained that she had been thinking about the incidents since her interview with the police, and she believed she might have remembered some details that could be relevant to the investigation. Chief Thornfield agreed to visit Mrs. Keller at her home later that afternoon, following the completion of her regular administrative duties. The request represented the kind of community cooperation that made law enforcement work more effective in small towns, where residents felt comfortable contacting the police department and contributing information that might help resolve problems affecting their neighborhoods. The remainder of the afternoon was spent reviewing departmental policies and procedures, updating case files, and preparing for the evening shift change that would bring Officer Thomas Bradley to duty for the overnight hours. Officer Bradley had worked the night shift for 6 years and was familiar with the quiet rhythms of Millhaven during the hours when most residents were asleep and the town settled into its peaceful nocturnal state. At 4 o'clock, Chief Thornfield drove to Elm Street for her appointment with Mrs. Keller, arriving to find the neighborhood basking in the golden light of late afternoon. The autumn colors had intensified over the past few days, with maple and oak trees displaying brilliant shades of red, orange, and yellow that created a spectacular canopy over the residential streets. The air carried the crisp freshness of seasonal change, mixed with the smoke from fireplaces where residents had begun enjoying the cozy warmth of fires during the cooler evenings. Mrs. Keller welcomed Chief Thornfield into her living room, where the bay window provided the same excellent view of the alley and neighboring properties that had made her an important witness to the unusual nighttime activities. The room was furnished with comfortable chairs and small tables that held books, magazines, and the kinds of decorative objects that reflected a lifetime of careful selection and arrangement. Mrs. Keller explained that she had spent considerable time thinking about the sounds she had heard during the night of the disturbances, trying to recall details that might help the police understand what had occurred. She had remembered that the footsteps had seemed to follow a very specific pattern, almost as if the person responsible had been following a predetermined route rather than wandering randomly through the neighborhood. More significantly, Mrs. Keller had recalled that the sounds had included what seemed to be brief pauses at certain locations, as if the person had stopped to examine something or to perform some specific activity before continuing along their route. These pauses had occurred near Mr. Finch's tool shed, close to Mrs. Vasquez's back gate, and at what appeared to be the corner where Mrs. Vasquez's property adjoined the vacant lot that separated her house from the property belonging to the Williams family. The vacant lot was a small parcel of land that had remained undeveloped due to drainage issues that made construction problematic. The lot was overgrown with native vegetation and had become a habitat for small wildlife, including rabbits, squirrels, and various bird species that residents enjoyed observing from their windows. The property was owned by the city and was maintained as an informal green space, though it received little active management beyond occasional mowing to prevent the vegetation from becoming too dense. Mrs. Keller's additional recollections provided Chief Thornfield with new information about the pattern of the mysterious footsteps and suggested specific locations that might warrant closer examination. The pauses that Mrs. Keller had remembered could indicate that the person responsible had been searching for something, hiding something, or conducting some form of surveillance that required stopping at particular vantage points. Following her meeting with Mrs. Keller, Chief Thornfield walked through the alley and examined the locations where the pauses had reportedly occurred. The area near Mr. Finch's toolshed showed the same signs of disturbed ground that had been noted during the initial investigation, though no additional evidence had appeared since that examination. The spot near Mrs. Vasquez's back gate appeared unremarkable, with only the compressed grass that had been observed previously. The corner where Mrs. Vasquez's property met the vacant lot presented a more interesting prospect for investigation. The area was partially concealed by overgrown shrubs and offered a vantage point from which someone could observe multiple properties while remaining relatively hidden. Chief Thornfield made note of this location as a priority for more detailed examination and decided that it would be included in the evening patrol routes. As the afternoon turned toward evening, Chief Thornfield returned to the station to brief Officer Bradley about the day's developments and to ensure that the night shift would include thorough attention to the Elm Street neighborhood. Officer Bradley was experienced in conducting surveillance operations and understood the importance of patient observation in situations where the nature of the problem remained unclear. Evening routine at the police station included the usual transition activities that marked the change between day and night shifts, updating log books, reviewing any calls or reports that had been received during the day, and discussing special assignments or areas that required additional attention. Officer Bradley reviewed the file related to the Elm Street disturbances and expressed his willingness to conduct extended surveillance if circumstances warranted such action. Thornfield decided to remain at the station until approximately 8 o'clock, providing overlap with the night shift and ensuring that any developments during the early evening hours would receive immediate attention. The station remained quiet during this period, with only routine calls related to traffic issues, requests for information about city services, and one report of a minor fender bender that had been resolved without requiring police response. At 7:15, the station received a call from Mr. Harold Finch, who reported that he had observed someone moving through the vacant lot adjacent to his property. Mr. Finch explained that he had been working in his garage when he noticed movement in the overgrown vegetation that bordered the lot. When he had stopped his work to observe more carefully, he had seen what appeared to be a person moving slowly through the tall grass and weeds, but the individual had disappeared before he could determine their identity or purpose. Chief Thornfield immediately dispatched Officer Bradley to investigate Mr. Finch's report, while she contacted Mrs. Keller and Mrs. Vasquez to inquire whether they had observed any unusual activity in their neighborhood. Both women reported that they had seen nothing unusual, though Mrs. Keller mentioned that she had been away from her bay window for approximately 30 minutes while preparing dinner. Officer Bradley arrived at the scene within minutes of receiving the dispatch and began a systematic examination of the vacant lot where the activity had been reported. The lot covered approximately half an acre and was bounded by residential properties on 3 sides and a small commercial building on the 4th. The vegetation included mature trees, dense shrubs, and areas of tall grass that provided numerous places where someone could move without being easily detected. The examination of the vacant lot revealed several areas where the vegetation had been disturbed, including what appeared to be a narrow path that led from the corner near Mrs. Vasquez's property toward the center of the lot. The path was not obvious and could easily have been created by wildlife movement, but its location and direction suggested that it might have been used by someone attempting to move through the area while avoiding detection. Near the center of the lot, Officer Bradley discovered a small cleared area where someone appeared to have removed vegetation and debris to create a space, approximately 6 feet in diameter. The area contained no obvious evidence of its purpose, but the deliberate nature of the clearing suggested human activity rather than natural causes. Officer Bradley photographed the location and marked it for more detailed examination during daylight hours. The investigation of the vacant lot continued until approximately 9 o'clock, when Officer Bradley concluded that no person was currently present in the area. His report documented the locations where vegetation had been disturbed and noted the cleared area that would require further investigation. The immediate concern about someone potentially hiding in the lot had been resolved, though the evidence suggested that the area had indeed been used for some unknown purpose. Chief Thornfield reviewed Officer Bradley's findings and decided that the vacant lot represented a significant development in the investigation of the Elm Street disturbances. The possibility that someone had been using the lot as a base for activities in the surrounding neighborhood provided a logical explanation for the mysterious footsteps and suggested specific areas where additional evidence might be discovered. The evening patrol schedule was modified to include regular checks of the vacant lot and the surrounding properties, with Officer Bradley instructed to maintain surveillance from positions that would allow him to observe both the lot and the residential areas where the original disturbances had been reported. The investigation had evolved from a simple trespassing complaint to a more complex situation that required systematic observation and evidence collection. As the night shift settled into its routine, Chief Thornfield prepared to leave the station with the satisfaction of knowing that the investigation was progressing and that new information was providing clearer direction for their efforts. The mysterious footsteps of Elm Street were beginning to yield their secrets, though many questions remained to be answered about the purpose and identity of whoever was responsible for the unusual activities. Town of Millhaven continued its peaceful evening routine, with residents unaware of the careful police surveillance that was being conducted in their neighborhood. The investigation had reached a point where patience and methodical observation would be required to gather the evidence needed to understand what was happening in the quiet residential area where 3 citizens had reported disturbances that challenged their sense of security and normalcy. Chief Thornfield drove home through the familiar streets of her community, noting the warm light that glowed in windows where families were enjoying their evening activities. The investigation of the Elm Street incidents had reminded her of why she had chosen a career in law enforcement: the opportunity to protect the peace and security that allowed residents to live their lives without fear or concern about unusual and unexplained events in their neighborhoods. The next phase of the investigation would require expanded surveillance, detailed examination of the physical evidence that had been discovered, and continued cooperation with residents who might provide additional information about activities in their neighborhood. Chief Thornfield looked forward to solving the mystery that had disrupted the routine tranquility of Millhaven, while ensuring that the investigation itself did not become a source of anxiety or concern for the community she served. The town settled into its nighttime quiet, with streetlights casting familiar patterns of illumination and shadow across the residential neighborhoods, where generations of families had found safety, comfort, and the kind of peaceful existence that represented the best of small-town life. The investigation would continue, but the essential character of Millhaven remained unchanged, protected by the careful attention of those who had dedicated themselves to preserving the community's cherished way of life. The morning sun filtered through the maple leaves that lined Cedar Avenue, casting dappled shadows across the sidewalk where Mrs. Florence Whitman typically took her daily walk at precisely 8:30 each morning. For 12 years, residents of the quiet residential street had grown accustomed to seeing her slender figure moving at a measured pace along the familiar route that took her from her small cottage at 412 Cedar Avenue to the town square around the perimeter of the park, and back home in time to prepare her morning tea. Mrs. Whitman's routine had become one of those reliable constants that gave shape to the daily rhythms of Millhaven, like the church bells that chimed the hour from St. Matthew's Episcopal, the whistle from the lumber mill that marked the shift changes, or the evening migration of crows that gathered in the oak trees behind the high school before settling for the night. Her absence on this particular Wednesday morning created a subtle disruption in the familiar pattern of neighborhood life, though it would be several hours before anyone recognized that disruption as significant. The first person to notice that something might be amiss was Robert Chun, a retired postal worker who lived at 408 Cedar Avenue and had developed the habit of timing his own morning activities around the predictable schedule of his neighbors. Robert had moved to Millhaven 6 years earlier, following his retirement from the postal service in a larger city, and he had found great comfort in the orderly routines of small-town life. His morning ritual included preparing coffee while standing at his kitchen window, from which he could observe the familiar activities that marked the beginning of each new day. When 8:30 passed, without the appearance of Mrs. Whitman's familiar figure, Robert initially assumed that she might have altered her schedule for some practical reason, an early medical appointment, a visit from relatives, or perhaps simply a decision to sleep later than usual. Such minor variations in routine were not uncommon, and Robert had learned not to read too much significance into small departures from established patterns. By 9 o'clock, however, Robert had begun to feel a nagging sense of concern that he could not easily dismiss. Mrs. Whitman was known throughout the neighborhood for her punctuality and her adherence to the daily schedule that had structured her life since her retirement from her position as a librarian at the Millhaven Public Library. Even when weather conditions were less than ideal, she maintained her morning walks, sometimes adjusting the route slightly, but never abandoning the routine that provided both physical exercise and social connection with the community she had called home for over 3 decades. Robert decided to take his own morning walk earlier than usual, following the route that Mrs. Whitman typically traveled in the hope that he might encounter her along the way or discover some simple explanation for her absence from the usual schedule. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn light that made even familiar sights seem particularly beautiful and worthy of contemplation. The walk from Cedar Avenue to the town square took Robert past several houses where he had become acquainted with other residents through the casual interactions that occurred when people maintained regular outdoor activities. Mrs. Dorothy Martinez, who lived at 325 Cedar Avenue, was tending her flower garden and greeted Robert with the friendly wave that had become customary between neighbors who respected each other's privacy while maintaining cordial relations. At the town square, Robert made a complete circuit of the park, observing the benches where Mrs. Whitman sometimes paused to rest during her walks and the fountain where she occasionally stopped to watch the sparrows that gathered to drink and bathe in the shallow basin. The square was peaceful in the morning light, with only a few other early walkers and the maintenance crew that arrived each day to ensure that the landscaping remained neat and attractive for visitors and residents alike. The return journey along Cedar Avenue brought Robert past Mrs. Whitman's cottage, a modest single-story house that she had inherited from her aunt and had carefully maintained through years of attentive care and modest improvements. The house was painted white with blue trim, and the small front yard featured flower beds that Mrs. Whitman tended with the same methodical attention she brought to all aspects of her daily life. From the sidewalk, Robert could see that the morning newspaper remained on the front porch where it had been delivered before dawn, and the curtains in the front windows were drawn in the position they typically occupied during the overnight hours. These observations, combined with Mrs. Whitman's absence from her usual morning walk, began to coalesce into a pattern that suggested something more than a simple change in routine. Robert returned to his own house with a growing sense of unease, though he remained uncertain about whether his concerns warranted any specific action. He had lived in cities where people often went for days without contact with their neighbors, and he had learned to respect the privacy and independence that residents of small towns valued just as highly as their sense of community. The balance between neighborly concern and inappropriate intrusion required careful navigation, particularly when dealing with someone as private and self-contained as Mrs. Whitman. By noon, Robert had decided that his concerns were significant enough to warrant a gentle inquiry about Mrs. Whitman's welfare. He walked to her house and knocked quietly on the front door, calling her name in a voice that would be audible inside the house without disturbing neighboring properties. When no response came, he tried the doorbell, which produced the familiar chime he had heard on previous occasions when Mrs. Whitman had answered the door to accept deliveries or speak with visitors. The lack of response to his inquiry prompted Robert to walk around the perimeter of the house, looking for any signs of activity or indications of what might have prevented Mrs. Whitman from maintaining her usual routine. The backyard was enclosed by a low fence that allowed him to see the small patio where Mrs. Whitman sometimes sat during pleasant weather, the garden where she grew vegetables and herbs for her own use, and the back door that provided access to the kitchen. Everything appeared to be in its normal state, with no signs of disturbance or unusual activity. The back door was closed and presumably locked. The patio furniture was arranged in its customary configuration, and the garden showed the neat organization that reflected Mrs. Whitman's careful attention to maintaining her property. Robert found no evidence that would explain her absence or suggest any cause for alarm beyond the simple fact that she had not appeared at her usual time and place. Robert returned to his own house and spent the early afternoon considering whether he should contact the police department to report his concerns about Mrs. Whitman's absence. He was aware that adults had the right to change their routines, travel without notification, or simply choose to spend time in ways that differed from their established patterns. However, his knowledge of Mrs. Whitman's character and habits made it difficult to believe that she would depart significantly from her routine without some compelling reason. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Robert called the Millhaven Police Department and spoke with Chief Thornfield, explaining his observations about Mrs. Whitman's absence and requesting guidance about whether the situation warranted official attention. Chief Thornfield listened carefully to Robert's account, asking questions about Mrs. Whitman's typical routine, her general health and circumstances, and the specific details that had prompted his concern. Chief Thornfield was familiar with Mrs. Whitman through the casual interactions that occurred between law enforcement and long-term residents of the community. She knew Mrs. Whitman to be a reliable and methodical person whose adherence to routine was both a personal preference and a practical approach to managing her independent lifestyle as a widow living alone. The absence from her morning walk, combined with the uncollected newspaper and lack of response to Robert's inquiry, created a pattern that warranted investigation. Chief Thornfield informed Robert that the police department would conduct a welfare check on Mrs. Whitman and would contact him if they required additional information or if the situation developed in ways that might affect the neighborhood. She thanked him for his vigilant concern and assured him that his decision to report the matter had been appropriate given the circumstances and his knowledge of Mrs. Whitman's usual habits. Officer Martinez was dispatched to conduct the initial welfare check, arriving at 412 Cedar Avenue at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She began by following the same approach that Robert had taken, knocking on the front door and calling Mrs. Whitman's name, then ringing the doorbell and waiting for a response that did not come. The afternoon was quiet except for the distant sounds of children playing in a nearby yard and the occasional passage of vehicles. Along Cedar Avenue, Officer Martinez walked around the perimeter of the property, examining the windows and doors for any signs of forced entry or unusual activity. The house appeared secure, with no evidence of disturbance or damage that might indicate criminal activity. The windows were closed and the curtains were drawn in positions that appeared normal for daytime hours when Mrs. Whitman might have been inside the house, engaged in routine activities. The investigation of Mrs. Whitman's property required careful attention to legal requirements. regarding entry into private residences without warrants or explicit permission. Officer Martinez contacted Chief Thornfield to discuss the situation and determine what additional steps might be appropriate, given the absence of any clear evidence of emergency or criminal activity. Chief Thornfield arrived at the scene to personally assess the situation and make decisions about how to proceed with the welfare check. Together, the two officers conducted a more thorough examination of the property, looking for any details that might provide insight into Mrs. Whitman's whereabouts or explain her absence from the usual routine that had prompted the initial concern. At the back of the house, Chief Thornfield noticed that one of the basement windows appeared to be slightly open, creating a gap of perhaps 2 inches that would allow air circulation, but would not be immediately obvious from a casual inspection. The window was located in a position that would be difficult to see from the street or from neighboring properties, and it provided a possible means of entry that would not require damage to doors or more visible windows. Partially open basement window raised questions about whether Mrs. Whitman might have opened it for ventilation purposes, whether it might have been inadvertently left open from previous activities, or whether it might indicate unauthorized entry by someone else. Chief Thornfield made the decision to enter the property through the basement window in order to conduct a thorough welfare check and ensure that Mrs. Whitman was not inside the house in a condition that prevented her from responding to inquiries. The basement of Mrs. Whitman's house was neat and organized, containing the typical items found in such spaces: seasonal decorations, furniture that was not currently in use, boxes containing books and personal items, and the mechanical systems that served the house. The basement showed no signs of disturbance or unusual activity, and a careful examination revealed no evidence that anyone had recently entered through the partially open window. The main floor of the house revealed a living environment that reflected Mrs. Whitman's orderly approach to managing her personal space. The kitchen was clean and organized, with dishes washed and put away, and no signs of interrupted meal preparation or other activities that might indicate a sudden departure. The living room and bedroom were similarly neat, with books and personal items arranged in ways that suggested normal daily routines rather than hasty packing or disrupted activities. In the bedroom, Chief Thornfield observed that the bed had been made with the careful attention to detail that characterized Mrs. Whitman's approach to household management. The closet contained clothing arranged in seasonal categories, and a quick inventory suggested that no obvious items were missing that would indicate travel or an extended absence from the house. The bathroom contained toiletries and medications arranged in their usual positions, with no evidence that Mrs. Whitman had packed items for travel or had been interrupted while preparing for her daily activities. A prescription medication bottle on the bathroom counter indicated that Mrs. Whitman had been taking medication for blood pressure, and the number of remaining pills suggested that she had not missed any doses during the previous several days. The investigation of the house interior provided no explanation for Mrs. Whitman's absence and no evidence of any circumstances that might have prevented her from maintaining her usual routine. The house appeared exactly as it would be expected to appear if Mrs. Whitman had simply left for her morning walk and had not yet returned, except for the fact that many hours had passed since she would normally have completed that walk and resumed her daily activities. Chief Thornfield and Officer Martinez spent additional time examining the property for any clues that might indicate where Mrs. Whitman had gone or what circumstances had led to her departure from normal routine. They found no notes indicating travel plans, no signs of packed luggage or clothing, and no evidence of any appointments or activities that might have required her to leave the house earlier than usual or remain away for an extended period. Investigation expanded to include interviews with neighbors who might have observed Mrs. Whitman's activities during the previous evening or early morning hours. Mrs. Dorothy Martinez, who lived 3 houses away from Mrs. Whitman, reported that she had seen lights in Mrs. Whitman's house during the previous evening at approximately 9 o'clock, which was consistent with her usual schedule for evening activities before preparing for bed. Mr. Kenneth Williams, who lived across the street from Mrs. Whitman, reported that he had not observed any unusual activity around her house, though he noted that his own schedule did not typically bring him to windows or outdoor areas during the early morning hours when Mrs. Whitman usually began her daily walk. He had not heard any sounds of disturbance during the night and had seen no unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood. Mrs. Sarah Thompson, whose property adjoined Mrs. Whitman's along the side yard, reported that she had heard what sounded like a door closing at approximately 6:30 in the morning, which was earlier than Mrs. Whitman's usual departure time, but not unusually early for someone who might have decided to begin their daily activities ahead of schedule. Mrs. Thompson had not looked outside at the time and could not confirm whether the sound had come from Mrs. Whitman's house or from another source. The interviews with neighbors provided some information about the timeline of Mrs. Whitman's possible departure from her house, but did not reveal any specific details about her destination or the circumstances that had led to her absence. The sound of a door closing at 6:30 in the morning suggested that Mrs. Whitman might have left her house voluntarily, though the early departure time was inconsistent with her established routine. As the afternoon progressed, Chief Thornfield made the decision to expand the search for Mrs. Whitman beyond her immediate neighborhood to include other areas where she might have gone for reasons that were not apparent from the initial investigation. Officer Chun was assigned to check the locations that Mrs. Whitman visited regularly as part of her weekly routine: the public library where she had worked and continued to volunteer, the grocery store where she shopped, and the medical offices where she received routine health care. Millhaven Public Library occupied a Carnegie building, constructed in 1908, and renovated several times to accommodate modern services, while preserving its historic character. The building served as both a repository for books and other materials, and as a community center where residents gathered for programs, meetings, and social activities. Mrs. Whitman had worked at the library for 28 years before her retirement and had continued to volunteer there twice a week, helping with cataloging projects and reading programs for children. Officer Chen spoke with Linda Patterson, the current head librarian, who reported that Mrs. Whitman had worked at the library on the previous Monday and had seemed to be in her usual good health and spirits. She had completed her assigned tasks efficiently and had engaged in normal conversation with staff members and patrons. Linda had not expected to see Mrs. Whitman again until her next scheduled volunteer session on Friday afternoon. The conversation with Linda Patterson revealed that Mrs. Whitman had mentioned being interested in some historical research related to properties in the older sections of Millhaven, though she had not provided specific details about the nature of her research or the particular properties that had captured her attention. Linda recalled that Mrs. Whitman had spent some time examining old maps and property records in the library's local history collection, but such research was not unusual for someone with Mrs. Whitman's background and interests. Officer Chun requested access to the materials that Mrs. Whitman had been examining during her recent visits to the library, hoping that they might provide some insight into activities or interests that could be related to her current absence. The local history collection included maps dating back to the town's founding, property records that documented changes in ownership over the decades, and photographs that illustrated the development of different neighborhoods and buildings. The records that Mrs. Whitman had been studying focused on the area around Elm Street and the surrounding residential blocks, including properties that had been developed during the early decades of the 20th century. The map showed the evolution of the neighborhood over time, including the creation of the alley system that provided access to residential properties and the designation of several small parcels as green space to preserve natural drainage patterns. Of particular interest was Mrs. Whitman's attention to records related to the vacant lot that had recently become significant in the investigation of the mysterious disturbances reported by residents of Elm Street. The property records showed that the lot had been owned by several different parties over the years before being acquired by the city for use as informal green space. Mrs. Whitman had made notes about the various ownership changes and had copied information about the property's legal description and boundaries. The discovery of Mrs. Whitman's research interest in the same area that was under investigation for unusual nighttime activities created a potential connection between her absence and the ongoing police investigation. Officer Chun immediately contacted Chief Thornfield to report this development and to suggest that the search for Mrs. Whitman should include a thorough examination of the vacant lot and surrounding areas. Chief Thornfield received Officer Chun's report while conducting her own investigation at the medical offices where Mrs. Whitman received routine health care. Dr. Patricia Morrison, Mrs. Whitman's primary physician, confirmed that Mrs. Whitman had no scheduled appointments and had not contacted the office about any health concerns or urgent needs. Her most recent visit had been 6 weeks earlier for a routine checkup that had revealed no significant problems and had resulted in refill prescriptions for medications to manage her blood pressure. The connection between Mrs. Whitman's historical research and the Elm Street investigation prompted Chief Thornfield to return immediately to the area where the original disturbances had been reported. She was joined by Officers Chen and Martinez, and together they began a systematic search of the vacant lot and the surrounding properties where previous evidence of unusual activity had been discovered. The search of the vacant lot revealed additional disturbances to the vegetation that had occurred since the previous examination. New areas of trampled grass and broken branches suggested that someone had moved through the lot recently, possibly during the early morning hours when Mrs. Whitman would typically have been beginning her daily walk. The cleared area that had been discovered during the initial investigation appeared to have been used again, with evidence of fresh disturbance to the soil and vegetation. Near the center of the cleared area, the officers discovered a small notebook that had been partially concealed beneath fallen leaves and debris. The notebook contained handwritten notes in what appeared to be Mrs. Whitman's careful script, documenting observations about activities in the neighborhood and recording times and dates when unusual events had been observed. The notebook revealed that Mrs. Whitman had been conducting her own investigation of the mysterious disturbances that had been reported by residents of Elm Street. Her notes indicated that she had observed unusual activities during several of her early morning walks, including evidence that someone was using the vacant lot for purposes that were not immediately apparent. She had documented these observations with the methodical approach that had characterized her professional work as a librarian. According to her notes, Mrs. Whitman had observed signs that someone was regularly visiting the vacant lot during the pre-dawn hours, leaving behind evidence of activities that included the creation of the cleared area and the establishment of what appeared to be temporary storage locations for items that were not immediately visible. She had noted changes in the vegetation patterns and had recorded her observations about the timing and frequency of these activities. The final entries in the notebook were dated for the previous evening and early morning, indicating that Mrs. Whitman had planned to conduct additional observations of the area during the hours when the unusual activities typically occurred. Her last entry, written at approximately 5:30 in the morning, noted that she was preparing to position herself where she could observe the vacant lot and potentially identify the person or persons responsible for the disturbances. The discovery of Mrs. Whitman's notebook provided crucial information about her whereabouts and activities during the hours preceding her disappearance, but it also raised serious concerns about her safety and welfare. Her decision to conduct surveillance of the area during the early morning hours had placed her in a situation where she might have encountered whoever was responsible for the activities she had been investigating. Chief Thornfield immediately expanded the search to include all areas within a reasonable walking distance of the vacant lot, focusing on locations where Mrs. Whitman might have positioned herself for observation, or where she might have gone if her surveillance activities had been discovered by the person she was trying to identify. The search required careful coordination to ensure that all potential areas were examined while preserving any evidence that might be relevant to understanding what had occurred. As the afternoon turned toward evening, the search for Mrs. Whitman continued with the assistance of additional personnel and volunteers from the community. The investigation had evolved from a simple welfare check to a missing person case that appeared to be connected to the ongoing investigation of unusual activities in the residential neighborhood where Mrs. Whitman had focused her research and observations. The peaceful town of Millhaven found itself confronting a mystery that challenged the sense of security and predictability that residents had long taken for granted. The disappearance of Mrs. Whitman represented not only a personal tragedy for someone who had contributed significantly to the community throughout her life, but also a sobering reminder that even the most familiar and comfortable places could harbor secrets that required careful investigation to understand and resolve. The basement of the Millhaven police station held the accumulated records of nearly 6 decades of law enforcement in a community where serious crime had always been rare, and most incidents involved the kind of minor disputes and misunderstandings that could be resolved through patient conversation and mutual respect. The filing cabinets that lined the walls contained thousands of reports, documenting everything from traffic violations and noise complaints to the occasional burglary or domestic disturbance that had required official intervention and careful documentation. Chief Thornfield descended the narrow stairs to the basement archive room early Thursday morning, carrying a cup of coffee and the determination to search through years of records for any cases that might provide insight into the current investigation. The disappearance of Mrs. Florence Whitman had transformed what had begun as reports of mysterious footsteps into a serious missing person case that required every available resource and investigative technique that the small police department could bring to bear. The archive room was illuminated by fluorescent lights that cast a steady, somewhat harsh glow over the rows of filing cabinets and the small desk where records could be reviewed and copied when necessary. The air in the room carried the distinctive smell of old paper and the metallic scent of the filing cabinets that had housed these documents through decades of seasonal temperature changes and the gradual accumulation of time. Chief Thornfield had decided to begin her review with records from the past 15 years, working backward chronologically while focusing on any incidents that had occurred in the residential neighborhoods around Elm Street and the surrounding areas. Her experience had taught her that patterns of unusual activity often had historical precedents that might not have been recognized as significant when they occurred, but could provide crucial context for understanding current events. The filing system that had been maintained by her predecessor, Chief Ronald Matthews, was methodical and comprehensive, with cases organized by date and cross-referenced by location, type of incident, and names of individuals involved. Each file contained not only the official reports prepared by investigating officers, but also supplementary materials, including photographs, witness statements, and correspondence that had been generated during the course of investigations. The first several years of records revealed the expected range of minor incidents that typically occupied the attention of law enforcement in a peaceful community. Traffic accidents involving property damage but no injuries, complaints about barking dogs that had been resolved through neighborly conversation, reports of suspicious vehicles that had turned out to be visiting relatives unfamiliar with local parking regulations, and the occasional domestic dispute that had been mediated without requiring arrests or formal charges. However, as Chief Thornfield worked her way through the files from 7 years earlier, she began to discover a pattern of reports that seemed to have similarities to the current situation. During the autumn months of that year, the police department had received several calls about unusual nighttime activities in residential neighborhoods, though the incidents had been scattered across different areas of town and had not been recognized as potentially related at the time they occurred. The first of these historical reports had come from Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, the same resident who had recently reported the mysterious footsteps in her backyard on Elm Street. 7 years earlier, Mrs. Vasquez had called to report that someone had been walking through her garden during the early morning hours, leaving footprints in the soft soil around her vegetable plants, but causing no damage that would suggest malicious intent. The responding officer had been James Woolworth, who was still serving with the department and would remember the incident if asked about it. Officer Woolworth's report indicated that he had found evidence supporting Mrs. Vasquez's complaint, including clear footprints in the garden soil, but had been unable to determine the identity or purpose of the person responsible. The incident had been classified as trespassing, though no arrest had been made and no similar reports had been received in the immediate aftermath. 3 weeks after Mrs. Vasquez's report, the police department had received a similar call from Harold Finch, who lived in the house adjacent to Mrs. Vasquez. Mr. Finch had reported that someone had been moving around his tool shed during the night, and he had found evidence that the person had attempted to look through the windows of the building. Like the previous incident, no damage had been done and nothing appeared to have been stolen, but the unauthorized presence on his property had been cause for concern. Officer Woolworth had investigated this incident as well, finding the same kind of evidence that had been discovered during the current investigation. Disturbed ground around the tool shed, small stones scattered beneath the windows, and signs that someone had spent considerable time examining the building without making any attempt to force entry or damage the property. The historical records revealed that both Mrs. Vasquez and Mr. Finch had experienced similar disturbances during 2 additional nights over the following month, though the incidents had gradually diminished in frequency before stopping entirely by early December. The final report related to these activities had been filed in mid-November, and it involved Mrs. Dorothy Keller, who had called to report sounds of movement in the alley behind her house. The pattern of reports from 7 years earlier was remarkably similar to the current situation, involving the same 3 residents in the same neighborhood and describing the same kind of mysterious nighttime activities that left physical evidence but provided no clear explanation of their purpose or the identity of the person responsible. The historical incidents had been investigated individually, but the connection between them had not been fully recognized, and the case had been allowed to remain unsolved when the activity stopped occurring. Chief Thornfield made photocopies of all the relevant reports from 7 years earlier and prepared a summary that highlighted the similarities between the historical incidents and the current investigation. The discovery of this pattern suggested that whatever was happening in the Elm Street neighborhood was not a new phenomenon, but rather a recurring pattern of activity that had previously occurred and then ceased for reasons that were not documented in the police records. Investigation of the historical records also revealed information about the vacant lot that had become central to the current case. 7 years earlier, the lot had been the subject of several complaints from neighboring residents about unauthorized dumping of yard waste and construction debris. The complaints had been resolved through increased patrol attention and the installation of better barriers to prevent vehicular access, but the records indicated that the lot had continued to attract occasional unauthorized use. One report from 6 years earlier described the discovery of what appeared to be a temporary campsite in the vacant lot, including evidence that someone had cleared an area for sleeping and had stored personal belongings in a location that was concealed from casual observation. The campsite had been dismantled by city workers, and the items found there had been processed as abandoned property, but no one had ever come forward to claim them or explain their presence in the lot. The abandoned property inventory from that incident included items that seemed inconsistent with typical homeless camping, surveying equipment, detailed maps of residential neighborhoods, and a notebook containing what appeared to be observations about the daily routines and schedules of various residents. These items had been stored in the police department's evidence room for the required period before being disposed of. According to standard procedures, Chief Thornfield realized that the notebook discovered 6 years earlier might have been similar to the one that Mrs. Whitman had been keeping during her own investigation of the recent disturbances. The possibility that someone had been conducting systematic surveillance of residential neighborhoods over an extended period of time suggested a level of organization and purpose that transformed the nature of the investigation from isolated incidents to a pattern of behavior that might have continued intermittently over many years. The evidence room where the abandoned property had been stored was located adjacent to the archive room, and Chief Thornfield decided to examine what remained of the materials that had been collected from the vacant lot 6 years earlier. Most items had been disposed of according to schedule, but department policy required that certain categories of evidence be retained indefinitely, particularly items that might be relevant to unsolved cases or ongoing investigations. Evidence room contained shelves of boxes and containers holding materials related to cases that remained active or had been closed but retained for historical reference. The items from the vacant lot campsite were stored in a box labeled with the case number and date of collection, along with a brief description of the contents and the circumstances of their discovery. The notebook from the campsite, which had been retained because of its potential relevance to understanding unauthorized activities in residential areas, contained detailed observations about the daily routines of residents throughout several neighborhoods in Millhaven. The handwriting was different from Mrs. Whitman's careful script, but the content and organization were remarkably similar to the notes she had been making during her recent investigation. The notebook contained schedules documenting when various residents left for work, returned home, walked their dogs, tended their gardens, and engaged in other routine activities. The observations were organized by street address and included diagrams showing the layout of properties, the locations of windows and doors, and the times when exterior lights were typically turned on and off. Of particular significance was a section of the notebook devoted to properties on Elm Street, including detailed observations about Mrs. Vasquez, Mr. Finch, and Mrs. Keller that corresponded closely to the areas where mysterious disturbances had been reported both 7 years earlier and during the current investigation. The notes indicated that the person responsible for the surveillance had been particularly interested in the patterns of nighttime activity, particularly in the Paulentico neighborhood, and it identified optimal times and locations for moving through the area without detection. The discovery of this historical evidence suggested that the current investigation was connected to a pattern of activities that had been occurring intermittently for at least 6 years, possibly longer. The person or persons responsible appeared to have been conducting systematic surveillance of residential neighborhoods, with particular attention to areas where they could move undetected during nighttime hours. Chief Thornfield expanded her review of the historical records to include cases from as far back as 10 years earlier, searching for any additional incidents that might be part of the same pattern of activity. This extended review revealed several other reports that had not been connected at the time they occurred, but now appeared to be part of a consistent pattern of unauthorized surveillance and nighttime movement through residential areas. 12 years earlier, the police department had received reports from residents of Maple Street about someone moving through their backyards during the early morning hours. The incidents had been investigated individually, but no pattern had been recognized and no arrests had been made. The reports had described the same kind of deliberate, repetitive movement that characterized the current Elm Street incidents. 9 years earlier, similar reports had come from residents of Oak Street, involving nighttime disturbances and evidence of unauthorized presence on private property. These incidents had also been investigated, individually without recognition of their potential connection to other activities occurring in different parts of town. The pattern that emerged from this comprehensive review of historical records suggested that someone had been conducting intermittent surveillance of residential neighborhoods throughout Millhaven for over a decade, possibly longer. The activities appeared to follow a cyclical pattern, with periods of intensive activity followed by months or years of quiescence before resuming in the same or different areas. The realization that Mrs. Whitman had disappeared while investigating activities that were part of a long-term pattern of unauthorized surveillance added urgency to the search for her and raised serious concerns about her safety. If she had encountered the person responsible for these activities during her early morning observations, she might have been perceived as a threat that required elimination or containment. Chief Thornfield called Officer Woolworth to the station to discuss his memories of the incidents from 7 years earlier and to determine whether he had observed any details that had not been included in the official reports. Officer Woolworth arrived within 30 minutes and spent considerable time reviewing the historical files and refreshing his memory about the cases he had investigated. Officer Woolworth recalled that the incidents 7 years earlier had struck him as unusual because of their repetitive nature and the lack of any apparent criminal purpose. The person responsible had clearly been trespassing on private property, but had caused no damage and had taken nothing of value. The activities had seemed more like surveillance than attempted burglary or vandalism. During his investigation of the historical incidents, Officer Woolworth had attempted to establish surveillance of the Elm Street area, but had been unable to observe any suspicious activity during the times when he was positioned to monitor the neighborhood. The mysterious footsteps and other disturbances had continued to be reported by residents, but had seemed to occur only when no official surveillance was in place. Officer Woolworth's recollection of these details suggested that the person responsible for the activities was aware of police patrol schedules and was able to time their activities to avoid detection by law enforcement. This level of awareness and planning indicated a sophisticated understanding of local law enforcement procedures and suggested that the surveillance activities were being conducted by someone with considerable knowledge of the community and its routines. Investigation of historical records also revealed information about Mrs. Whitman that provided additional context for understanding her recent research activities. Her personnel file from the public library indicated that she had maintained an interest in local history throughout her career and had been involved in several projects documenting the development of Millhaven's residential neighborhoods. Mrs. Whitman had contributed articles to the local Historical Society newsletter about the evolution of different areas of town, including detailed research about property ownership, architectural styles, and the social history of various neighborhoods. Her expertise in research methods and her familiarity with historical records would have made her well equipped to recognize patterns in the mysterious activities that might not be apparent to their observers. The library records showed that Mrs. Whitman had been researching property histories in the Elm Street area for several weeks prior to her disappearance, focusing on changes in ownership and land use over the past several decades. Her research had included examination of old city directories, property tax records, and planning documents that detailed the development of the residential neighborhoods where the mysterious activities had been occurring. One aspect of Mrs. Whitman's research that proved particularly significant was her investigation of properties that had changed hands frequently or had been vacant for extended periods during the past decade. Several of these properties were located in areas where reports of nighttime disturbances had been made, suggesting that the person responsible might have been taking advantage of vacant properties to establish temporary bases for surveillance activities. The connection between property vacancies and the timing of mysterious activities provided a new avenue for investigation that Chief Thornfield decided to pursue immediately. A review of city records could identify all properties that had been vacant during the periods when suspicious activities had been reported, potentially revealing a pattern that could help predict where future incidents might occur. The afternoon was spent coordinating with the city clerk's office to obtain records of property transfers, vacancy periods, and rental histories for all residential properties in the areas where mysterious activities had been reported. This information would be cross-referenced with the dates of reported incidents to determine whether there was a correlation between property vacancies and the timing of surveillance activities. Officer Chun was assigned to interview real estate agents and property managers who had been involved in rentals and sales in the affected neighborhoods during the relevant time periods. These interviews might reveal information about prospective renters or buyers who had shown unusual interest in properties or had asked questions that seemed inconsistent with normal residential purposes. Officer Martinez continued the search for Mrs. Whitman, focusing on areas where she might have hidden to observe the vacant lot and surrounding properties. The search had been expanded to include abandoned buildings, wooded areas, and other locations where she might have sought concealment during her surveillance activities or where she might have been taken if her investigation had been discovered by the person she was trying to identify. As the day progressed, the investigation evolved from a missing person case to a comprehensive review of years of mysterious activities that appeared to be connected by a pattern of systematic surveillance and unauthorized access to residential neighborhoods. The disappearance of Mrs. Whitman had provided the catalyst for recognizing this pattern, but her safety remained the primary concern driving the expanded investigation. The search for Mrs. Whitman continued into the evening hours with volunteers from the community joining law enforcement personnel to examine all areas within walking distance of her home and the vacant lot where her notebook had been discovered. The search was organized systematically to ensure that no potential location was overlooked, while maintaining hope that Mrs. Whitman would be found safe and able to provide crucial information about what she had observed during her investigation. The investigation had revealed that Millhaven's peaceful surface concealed a mystery that had been developing over many years, involving someone who possessed detailed knowledge of the community and its residents. The pattern of surveillance activity suggested a level of organization and persistence that transformed what had initially appeared to be isolated incidents into evidence of a long-term campaign of unauthorized observation and data collection. Chief Thornfield concluded the day with a comprehensive briefing for all department personnel, outlining the connections that had been discovered between current and historical incidents and establishing priorities for the expanded investigation. The safety of Mrs. Whitman remained the immediate priority, but the broader implications of the surveillance pattern required careful attention to ensure that other residents were not at risk. The peaceful town of Millhaven faced the realization that its cherished sense of security had been compromised by activities that had been occurring undetected for years. The investigation would require not only finding Mrs. Whitman and ensuring her safety, but also identifying the person responsible for the systematic surveillance and determining the purpose behind activities that had remained mysterious despite years of intermittent occurrence. As night fell over the community, residents went about their evening routines, unaware that their daily patterns had been the subject of careful observation and documentation by someone whose identity and motives remained unknown. The investigation would continue with renewed urgency and expanded scope, driven by the determination to restore the sense of security that had made Millhaven a place where people could live their lives without fear of unauthorized surveillance or mysterious intrusions into their private spaces. The Clearwater River had shaped the geography and character of Millhaven since the town's founding in 1873, when Samuel Millhaven recognized the potential of the gentle waterway to power the sawmill that would form the foundation of the community's early economy. The river curved gracefully through the landscape, creating natural boundaries between neighborhoods and providing a corridor of green space that residents had come to treasure for its beauty and tranquility. On Friday morning, as the search for Mrs. Florence Whitman entered its third day, Chief Thornfield made the decision to extend the investigation to include the areas along the river where the terrain provided numerous locations where someone might seek concealment or where evidence of the mysterious surveillance activities might have been stored or abandoned. The river corridor offered a network of paths, clearings, and secluded spots that could serve purposes not immediately apparent to casual observers. Morning mist rose from the water's surface as Chief Thornfield and Officer Martinez began their systematic examination of the riverbank areas that lay within reasonable walking distance of Mrs. Whitman's home and the vacant lot where her notebook had been discovered. The autumn air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the clean smell of moving water, creating an atmosphere of peaceful beauty that seemed inconsistent with the serious nature of their search. The river path that connected different sections of town had been developed over many years through the collaborative efforts of city planners, volunteer groups, and residents who recognized the value of maintaining public access to the waterway. The path was paved in some sections and remained natural dirt and gravel in others, winding through areas of mature trees, open meadows, and small parks where benches provided resting places for walkers and runners who used the route for exercise and recreation. Along the section of river that flowed behind the residential neighborhoods where the mysterious activities had been concentrated, the path passed through areas of varied terrain that offered different levels of visibility and accessibility. Some stretches were open and well maintained, clearly visible from nearby houses and frequently used by residents taking their daily exercise. Other sections passed through more secluded areas where dense vegetation provided natural screening, and the sounds of the flowing water masked conversations and other activities. Chief Thornfield had walked this path many times during her years of service, both for personal recreation and as part of her regular patrol activities that kept her connected with all areas of the community. Her familiarity with the route allowed her to recognize subtle changes in the landscape and to identify locations that might serve purposes beyond their obvious recreational functions. Approximately half a mile downstream from the residential area that had been the focus of recent investigations, the river path passed beneath a railroad bridge that carried the freight line connecting Millhaven to larger cities in neighboring counties. The bridge was constructed of steel and concrete with massive supports that created shadowed areas underneath, where the normal flow of foot traffic was disrupted and casual observation from the path above was limited. The area beneath the railroad bridge had accumulated debris over the years, including materials washed downstream during periods of high water and items that had been discarded by people using the path of the railroad right-of-way. City maintenance crews cleaned the area periodically, but the location's relative isolation and the challenging terrain made it a place where unauthorized activities could occur without immediate detection. Officer Martinez was the first to notice that the accumulated debris beneath the bridge appeared to have been organized rather than randomly deposited by natural forces. Pieces of wood, metal, and other materials had been arranged to create what appeared to be a makeshift shelter or storage area, partially concealed by larger items and positioned to take advantage of the natural screening provided by the bridge structure. A closer examination revealed that the makeshift shelter contained items that clearly indicated recent human use. A camping chair that showed minimal weathering, a plastic container that had been used to store food or other supplies, and a small metal box that contained maps, notebooks, and other materials that appeared to be related to the surveillance activities that had been the subject of the investigation. The maps found in the shelter included detailed street plans of Millhaven with particular properties marked in different colors, apparently indicating different types of surveillance targets or activities. The markings corresponded to many of the addresses where mysterious nighttime disturbances had been reported over the years. suggesting that this location had served as a planning and coordination center for the systematic observation of residential neighborhoods. The notebooks discovered in the shelter contained information that complemented and extended the records that had been found in Mrs. Whitman's notebook and in the historical evidence from the police archives. The handwriting was consistent with the notebook that had been found 6 years earlier in the vacant lot, indicating that the same person had been maintaining records of surveillance activities over an extended period. The most recent entries in the notebooks were dated within the past week and included detailed observations about Mrs. Whitman's research activities at the library and her pattern of morning walks that would have taken her past areas where surveillance was being conducted. These entries suggested that Mrs. Whitman had been observed and identified as a potential threat to the ongoing surveillance operations. The final entry in the most recent notebook was particularly concerning, as it described plans to address the library researcher and included references to relocation and temporary containment that suggested Mrs. Whitman might have been taken against her will to prevent her from interfering with or exposing the surveillance activities. Chief Thornfield immediately contacted the station to request additional personnel and resources for what had now become a kidnapping investigation, with implications that extended far beyond the simple trespassing complaints that had initiated the case. The discovery of the shelter and its contents provided crucial evidence about the organization and extent of the surveillance activities, but more importantly, it offered potential leads about Mrs. Whitman's whereabouts and condition. The investigation of the Riverside shelter revealed additional information about the methods and equipment that had been used for the surveillance activities. The shelter contained binoculars, cameras with telephoto lenses, and recording equipment that would allow detailed observation and documentation of activities in residential areas from concealed positions. The sophistication of the equipment suggested that the surveillance had been conducted with professional-level capability and attention to detail. Search of the surrounding area revealed evidence of additional temporary campsites and storage locations that had been used to support the surveillance activities over the years. These locations were positioned strategically to provide observation points for different neighborhoods while remaining concealed from casual discovery by residents or law enforcement personnel conducting routine patrols. The railway bridge area also provided access to a network of maintenance roads and abandoned industrial sites that had once served the lumber mill and other businesses that had formed the foundation of Millhaven's early economy. Many of these locations had been unused for years and offered potential hiding places where someone could establish temporary operations without attracting attention from residents or authorities. Officer Chun joined the search team at the railway bridge and was assigned to investigate the abandoned industrial areas that lay within the railroad corridor. These sites included several buildings that had been vacant for years, storage facilities that had been constructed to serve businesses that no longer operated, and maintenance areas that provided access to utility infrastructure, serving different parts of town. The abandoned lumber mill complex, located approximately 1 mile downstream from the railway bridge, had been closed for 15 years following changes in the regional economy that had eliminated the demand for its products. The buildings remained structurally sound but had been secured against unauthorized access through the installation of fencing and locks that were periodically inspected by city officials responsible for maintaining public safety. However, Officer Chun's investigation revealed that the security measures at the lumber mill had been compromised, with evidence of forced entry at several locations and signs that the buildings had been used recently for purposes that were not immediately apparent. The main mill building contained areas that had been cleared and organized to serve as temporary living and working spaces, with evidence of recent occupancy including food storage, sleeping arrangements, and work areas equipped with maps and surveillance equipment. The discovery of this larger facility suggested that the surveillance activities had been more extensive and sophisticated and been apparent from the previous evidence. The lumber mill complex provided space for equipment storage, data analysis, and potentially the temporary containment of someone whose activities had threatened the ongoing surveillance operations. Systematic search of the lumber mill buildings was conducted with particular attention to areas where Mrs. Whitman might be held, if she had indeed been taken by the person responsible for the surveillance activities. The search required careful attention to safety concerns, as the abandoned buildings contained potential hazards including unstable flooring, exposed electrical systems, and deteriorated structural elements. In the basement of the main mill building, the search team discovered a room that had been converted into what appeared to be a temporary detention facility. The room contained a cot, basic sanitary facilities, and supplies that would be necessary to maintain someone in confinement for an extended period. Evidence of recent use included food containers, medical supplies, and personal items that appeared to belong to an elderly woman. The discovery of the detention facility prompted an immediate expansion of the search to include all buildings in the lumber mill complex and the surrounding areas where Mrs. Whitman might have been moved if the basement location had been compromised. The search was conducted with urgency while maintaining the systematic approach necessary to ensure that no potential location was overlooked. Officer Martinez discovered additional evidence in a storage building adjacent to the main mill structure, including documents that provided insight into the motivation and organization behind the surveillance activities that had been conducted over many years. The documents revealed that the surveillance was part of a larger project involving the systematic documentation of social patterns and community relationships in small towns throughout the region. The project appeared to be academic or research-oriented in nature, with detailed methodologies for collecting and analyzing data about residential patterns, social interactions, and community dynamics. The documents referenced funding sources and institutional affiliations that suggested the work was being conducted under the auspices of a university or research organization, though the specific details were not immediately clear from the materials found at the Bandwa site. More disturbing was evidence that the research had evolved beyond simple observation to include what appeared to be experimental manipulation of community dynamics through the creation of mysterious events designed to test residents' responses to unusual situations. The reports of nighttime disturbances and unexplained activities appeared to be part of controlled experiments rather than random criminal behavior. The documentation found at the lumber mill included detailed analysis of how residents and law enforcement had responded to the various mysterious incidents over the years, with particular attention to the social networks that were activated when unusual events occurred and the methods by which information spread through the community. The research appeared to be focused on understanding how small communities maintained social cohesion and responded to perceived threats. However, the academic nature of the project did not excuse the unauthorized surveillance of residents or the apparent kidnapping of Mrs. Whitman when her investigation had threatened to expose the research activities. The discovery of the detention facility and evidence of her recent presence indicated that she was being held against her will to prevent her from revealing information that could compromise the ongoing research. The search for Mrs. Whitman continued with increased intensity as the investigation team worked to determine her current location and ensure her safety. The lumber mill complex was extensive, and the surrounding industrial area contained numerous buildings and facilities that required systematic examination to rule out all possible locations where she might be held. As the afternoon progressed, the search expanded to include the railway maintenance facilities that served the freight line passing through Mill Haven. These facilities included equipment storage buildings, repair shops, and administrative offices that had been constructed to support railway operations. but were now used only intermittently due to changes in transportation patterns and maintenance scheduling. The railway facilities provided another network of buildings and structures that could serve as temporary bases for surveillance activities or detention facilities for someone whose investigation had threatened to expose unauthorized research. The proximity to transportation infrastructure also offered potential means of quickly relocating equipment or personnel if the research project needed to be moved to avoid detection. Officer Woolworth joined the expanded search team and was assigned to investigate the railway facilities while maintaining coordination with railroad officials who needed to be informed about law enforcement activities in areas that fell under their jurisdictional responsibility. The cooperation between local police and railroad security personnel was essential to ensure that the search could be conducted safely and comprehensively. The investigation of railway facilities revealed additional evidence of unauthorized use, including temporary living arrangements in maintenance buildings and storage areas that contained surveillance equipment and research materials. The scale of the operation became increasingly apparent as more locations were discovered where the surveillance project had established bases for its activities. The search teams maintained communication through radio contact coordinated by Chief Thornfield from a command post established at the lumber mill complex. The systematic approach to the search was essential to ensure that all potential locations were examined while maintaining the safety of search personnel and preserving any evidence that might be relevant to understanding the full scope of the surveillance project. As evening approached, the search had covered a significant portion of the industrial and transportation infrastructure that lay within the river corridor, revealing the extensive nature of the surveillance operation that had been conducted without detection by residents or authorities. The project appeared to have been operating for many years with considerable resources and sophisticated methodology. The discovery of Mrs. Whitman's personal effects in the detention facility at the lumber mill provided confirmation that she had been taken against her will, but her current location remained unknown despite the comprehensive search that had been conducted throughout the day. The investigation had revealed the scope and organization of the surveillance project, but the primary objective of ensuring Mrs. Whitman's safety and securing her release remained UNACHIEVED. Chief Thornfield coordinated with county and state law enforcement agencies to expand the search beyond the immediate Millhaven area and to investigate the institutional connections that appeared to be funding and directing the surveillance research. The kidnapping of a local resident in connection with unauthorized research activities represented a serious crime that required resources and expertise beyond what the small-town police department could provide. Independently, the peaceful community of Millhaven had discovered that its cherished sense of security had been compromised not by random criminal activity, but by systematic research that had been conducted without the knowledge or consent of residents, whose lives had been observed, documented, and manipulated for academic purposes. The investigation had revealed the hidden infrastructure that had supported these activities, but the immediate concern remained the safety and rescue of Mrs. Whitman, whose investigation had led to her disappearance. The river that had shaped the character and development of Millhaven for over a century had concealed activities that violated the trust and privacy that residents had taken for granted throughout their lives. The ongoing investigation would require not only the rescue of Mrs. Whitman, but also a comprehensive examination of how unauthorized research had been conducted in their community for years without detection, and what measures would be necessary to prevent such violations from occurring in the future. As night fell over the expanded search area, law enforcement personnel and community volunteers continued their efforts to locate Mrs. Whitman while processing the disturbing revelation that their town had been the subject of unauthorized academic research that had crossed ethical and legal boundaries in pursuit of data about small-town social dynamics and community responses to unexplained events. The lives that unfolded quietly within the residential neighborhoods of Millhaven carried the accumulated weight of generations, each family's story contributing to the larger tapestry of community life that had been unknowingly observed and documented by researchers whose unauthorized study had violated the privacy and trust that formed the foundation of small-town existence. As the investigation continued into its fourth day, Chief Thornfield recognized the importance of understanding the personal histories and connections that might provide insight into why certain residents had become subjects of particular interest to the surveillance project. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had lived at 247 Elm Street for 32 years, occupying the same house where she had raised 3 children and tended the garden that had become a source of both practical sustenance and personal satisfaction throughout the decades of her residence. Her daily routines had evolved gradually over the years, shaped by changing family circumstances, health considerations, and the natural rhythm of seasonal activities that marked the passage of time in a community where many residents had deep roots and long memories. Eleanor's husband, Miguel Vasquez, had worked for 28 years at the regional power plant before his retirement, maintaining the steady employment that had allowed them to purchase their home and establish the kind of stable family life that both had experienced in their own childhoods. Miguel had passed away 4 years earlier following a brief illness, leaving Eleanor to continue the routines they had shared while adapting to the solitude that had become a permanent feature of her daily existence. The house on Elm Street held the memories of birthday parties, holiday celebrations, graduation ceremonies, and the countless smaller events that had marked the growth and development of their children through the years when family life had provided structure and purpose for both parents. The front porch where Eleanor now spent quiet evenings had once been a gathering place for neighborhood children whose games had filled the street with laughter and activity. During summer afternoons and weekend mornings, Eleanor's 3 children had moved away from Millhaven as adults, pursuing careers and establishing families in larger cities where opportunities matched their educational backgrounds and professional aspirations. Her daughter Maria lived in Denver, where she worked as a nurse and raised 2 children whose photographs filled the frames that decorated Eleanor's living room. Her son Carlos had settled in Phoenix, where his engineering career had provided the means to purchase a home similar to the one where he had grown up, though the desert landscape bore little resemblance to the tree-lined streets of his childhood. Her youngest son, David, had remained closest to home, living in a neighboring county where his work as a high school teacher allowed him to visit regularly and maintain the connection with family, traditions that had always been important to Eleanor. David's visits had become more frequent since Miguel's death, as he recognized his mother's need for ongoing contact with family members who shared her memories and understood the significance of maintaining the household routines that provided continuity with earlier periods of her life. The garden behind Eleanor's house reflected decades of careful planning and patient cultivation, with established perennial plants that returned each spring alongside annual vegetables and flowers that required replanting according to seasonal schedules. She had learned from her own mother. The soil had been improved over many years through the addition of compost and organic matter, creating growing conditions that produced abundant harvests of tomatoes, peppers, beans, and other crops that had supplemented the family's food supply and provided surplus for sharing with neighbors. Eleanor's knowledge of gardening techniques and plant varieties had made her an informal resource for other residents who sought advice about managing their own growing spaces. Her willingness to share seeds, seedlings, and practical wisdom had created connections throughout the neighborhood that persisted, even as demographic changes brought new residents who were less familiar with traditional gardening practices. The mysterious disturbances that had disrupted Eleanor's sense of security in her own backyard represented a violation of the personal space where she had found solace and purpose. During the years since Miguel's death, the garden had become not only a source of fresh produce, but also a place of meditation and remembrance where she could feel connected to the shared activities that had once involved her, husband and children during happier periods of family life. Harold Finch, who lived in the adjacent house at 249 Elm Street, had moved to Millhaven 15 years earlier when his career as an automotive technician had brought him opportunities at the Ford dealership that served customers throughout the region. Harold's background differed from that of many longtime residents, as he had grown up in a series of different towns where his father's military service had required frequent relocations that had prevented the development of deep community roots. The stability that Harold had found in Millhaven represented a conscious choice to establish the kind of permanent residence that had been absent from his childhood and early adult years. His purchase of the house on Elm Street had been motivated by a desire to create a home base where he could pursue interests and build relationships that would provide the sense of belonging that frequent moves had made difficult to achieve in previous locations. Harold's marriage to Janet, a teacher at the local elementary school, had strengthened his connections to the community and had led to their joint involvement in various civic activities and volunteer organizations that serve different aspects of community life. Janet's familiarity with local families through her teaching responsibilities had helped Harold understand the social networks and traditional practices that gave structure to daily life in a small town where many relationships traced back through multiple generations. The couple's decision not to have children had been based on practical considerations related to Janet's health concerns and their mutual commitment to devoting time and resources to activities that would benefit the broader community rather than focusing exclusively on family responsibilities. Their involvement in church activities, youth sports programs, and community service projects had provided outlets for nurturing instincts while contributing to the welfare of neighbors and friends. Harold's tool shed, which had become a focal point of the mysterious nighttime disturbances, contained not only lawn equipment and seasonal storage items, but also the accumulated tools and materials that reflected his mechanical skills and his preference for maintaining and repairing household items rather than replacing them. The shed represented his approach to problem solving and his belief in the value of craftsmanship and attention to detail that had served him well. Throughout his career, the workshop area within the shed contained project materials and equipment that Harold used for volunteer maintenance work at the church, the community center, and the homes of elderly residents who could no longer manage routine repairs independently. His willingness to donate time and expertise had created relationships throughout Millhaven that had deepened his sense of connection to the community and had established his reputation as someone who could be relied upon when practical assistance was needed. The invasion of Harold's property by unknown persons conducting unauthorized surveillance had affected his sense of security and had raised questions about the privacy that residents had taken for granted throughout their years of residence in what had appeared to be a safe and stable community. The violation of his personal space had been particularly disturbing because the shed contained not only his own belongings, but also tools and materials that belonged to community organizations whose trust he had accepted when volunteering for various maintenance projects. Dorothy Keller, whose house at 248 Elm Street provided the vantage point from which she had observed activities in the alley and neighboring properties, had lived in Millhaven for her entire 73 years, occupying the same house where she had been born and where she had cared for her aging parents during the final years of their lives. Dorothy's deep knowledge of neighborhood history and her understanding of family relationships throughout the community had made her an invaluable source of information about changes in local patterns and unusual activities that might not be immediately apparent to newer residents. Dorothy's unmarried status had been a conscious choice that had allowed her to remain available for caregiving responsibilities with elderly parents and had enabled her to maintain employment at the county courthouse were her clerical skills, and attention to detail had been valued throughout a career that had spanned 38 years. Her work with property records, marriage licenses, and other official documents had provided her with comprehensive knowledge of legal and financial changes affecting families throughout the region. The bay window from which Dorothy had observed the mysterious nighttime activities had been installed during renovations completed shortly after her parents' deaths, when she had converted their house into a comfortable home for her own retirement years. The window had been positioned to provide optimal views of the neighborhood activities that had always been a source of interest and concern for someone who felt responsible for maintaining awareness of situations that might affect community welfare. Dorothy's observations of neighborhood activities had always been motivated by genuine concern for her neighbors' well-being rather than idle curiosity about private affairs. Her long residence in the same location had given her baseline knowledge of normal patterns and routines that made it possible to recognize when unusual events required attention or when someone might need assistance with problems they were reluctant to discuss openly. The violation of neighborhood privacy through systematic surveillance had been particularly troubling for Dorothy because her own informal monitoring activities had been motivated by protective instincts and had always been conducted with respect for appropriate boundaries. The discovery that professional researchers had been observing and documenting the same activities that she watched from genuine concern for community welfare had raised uncomfortable questions about the difference between neighborly awareness and inappropriate intrusion. Mrs. Florence Whitman, whose disappearance had prompted the expanded investigation that had revealed the extent of unauthorized surveillance activities, represented the kind of community member whose contributions extended far beyond immediate family responsibilities to encompass broader cultural and educational enrichment that benefited residents throughout the region. Her career as a librarian had involved not only managing collections and assisting patrons with research needs, but also developing programs and services that had supported literacy, historical preservation, and lifelong learning opportunities. Florence's marriage to Thomas Whitman had lasted 41 years until his death from heart disease 7 years earlier, and their partnership had been characterized by shared interests in education, community service, and historical research that had led to collaborative projects documenting local history and preserving materials that might otherwise have been lost to time and changing circumstances. Thomas had worked as a high school history teacher, and their combined expertise had made them valuable resources for students, researchers, and community organizations seeking information about regional development and cultural traditions. The couple's decision not to have children had been influenced by Florence's early commitment to her professional responsibilities and their mutual belief that their contributions to community welfare could be maximized through activities that served the educational and cultural needs of many families rather than focusing exclusively on raising their own offspring. Their involvement in youth programs, historical societies, and educational initiatives had provided opportunities to influence and support the development of young people throughout their careers. Florence's home at 412 Cedar Avenue reflected the interests and values that had shaped her approach to both professional and personal activities. The house contained extensive book collections, historical documents and photographs, and research materials that had been accumulated over decades of investigation into various aspects of local and regional history. Her personal library had become an informal resource for community members pursuing their own research projects or seeking information about family histories and property developments. The methodical approach that Florence had brought to her investigation of the mysterious nighttime disturbances had been consistent with research skills developed through years of professional library work and historical research. Her ability to recognize patterns, organize information systematically, and pursue leads through multiple sources had made her investigation more thorough and potentially more threatening to the unauthorized surveillance project than casual observation by other residents might have been. Florence's disappearance had affected not only the immediate investigation of surveillance activities, but also the various community organizations and projects that had depended on her expertise and volunteer contributions. The Historical Society, the library's research programs, and several educational initiatives had been disrupted by her absence, creating gaps in knowledge and leadership that would be difficult to replace if her situation was not resolved successfully. The personal histories and family connections that characterized life in Millhaven had provided the researchers with rich material for their study of small-town social dynamics, but the same relationships and traditions also created networks of mutual support and concern that had been mobilized in response to the mysterious disturbances and Florence's disappearance. The community's response to these challenges had demonstrated the resilience and cohesion that the research project had sought to understand and document. Robert Chun, the retired postal worker who had first noticed Florence's absence from her usual morning routine, had spent 32 years delivering mail throughout the region before moving to Millhaven to enjoy retirement in a community where the pace of life matched his preferences for quiet activities and familiar surroundings. Robert's career had provided him with detailed knowledge of family patterns and neighborhood changes that had developed naturally through daily contact with residents in their homes and businesses. Robert's decision to report his concerns about Florence's absence had been based on understanding of her character and routines that had developed through casual interactions during the years since his retirement. His attentiveness to the subtle changes in neighborhood patterns reflected both personal concern for fellow residents and professional habits developed through years of postal work that required attention to details that might affect service delivery or indicate problems requiring attention. The military discipline and organizational skills that Robert had maintained since his service in the Army Reserve had influenced his approach to retirement activities and his interactions with neighbors and community organizations. His systematic approach to daily routines and his reliability in maintaining commitments had made him a valued member of volunteer groups and informal networks that provided practical assistance to residents who needed help with various activities. Robert's background in logistics and his experience with government procedures had been valuable during the investigation of Florence's disappearance, as he had been able to provide detailed information about her usual activities and had offered practical assistance with search coordination and communication activities. His willingness to become involved in community problem-solving reflected values and skills that had been shaped by both military service and civilian career experiences. Families and individuals whose quiet lives had been disrupted by unauthorized surveillance and mysterious disturbances represented the foundation of community life in Millhaven, where personal relationships, shared values, and mutual support had created the kind of social environment that the research project had sought to study and understand. However, the methods used by the researchers had violated the trust and privacy that made such communities possible, creating divisions and concerns that would require careful attention to heal and resolve. The investigation had revealed not only the scope of unauthorized surveillance activities, but also the strength of community bonds and the willingness of residents to work together when faced with challenges that threatened their sense of security and well-being. The response to Florence's disappearance had demonstrated the kinds of social networks and support systems that had made Millhaven an attractive place to live for families and individuals seeking stability and connection in an increasingly mobile and fragmented society. As the search for Florence continued and the investigation expanded to address the broader implications of unauthorized research activities, the personal stories and family histories that had been violated by surveillance would need to be honored and protected through measures that would prevent similar intrusions in the future, while preserving the openness and trust that had always characterized community life in their peaceful town. The methodical work of police investigation required patience attention to detail, and the ability to recognize patterns that might not be immediately apparent to casual observation. As Saturday morning brought the fifth day of searching for Mrs. Florence Whitman, the officers of the Millhaven Police Department had established a rhythm of careful documentation and systematic analysis that reflected their commitment to understanding not only the immediate crisis, but also the broader implications of the surveillance activities that had been conducted in their community for many years. Officer David Chin arrived at the station before dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and the determination to continue the painstaking process of cross-referencing historical records with the new information that had been discovered through the expanded investigation. The quiet hours before the official start of the workday provided the uninterrupted time necessary for the kind of detailed analysis that formed the foundation of effective law enforcement work in cases that extended beyond simple responses to immediate incidents. The conference room adjacent to Chief Thornfield's office had been converted into a temporary command center where maps, photographs, timelines, and evidence catalogs could be organized and displayed in ways that facilitated the collaborative analysis that had become essential to understanding the complexity of the surveillance project. The walls were covered with charts and diagrams that illustrated the connections between different incidents, locations, and individuals that had been identified through the Kiko investigation. Officer Chun began his morning work by updating the comprehensive timeline that had been developed to track all reported incidents of mysterious activities over the past 12 years. Each entry included the date, time, location, nature of the reported activity, responding officers, and outcome of the investigation. The timeline had revealed patterns that had not been apparent when the incidents were investigated individually, including seasonal variations in activity, levels, and geographical clusters that suggested systematic rather than random occurrence. The geographical analysis had been facilitated by large-scale maps of Millhaven that showed residential neighborhoods, commercial areas, transportation infrastructure, and natural features including the river corridor and wooded areas. Colored pins and connecting lines had been used to mark locations where incidents had been reported, revealing movement patterns and areas of concentrated activity that provided insight into the organization and methodology of the surveillance project. Officer Sarah Martinez arrived at 7 o'clock and immediately began reviewing the extensive photographic documentation that had been collected from the various search locations. The photographs included images of disturbed vegetation, makeshift shelters, surveillance equipment, documents, and personal effects that had been discovered during the investigation of the river corridor and abandoned industrial facilities. The photographic evidence required careful cataloging and analysis to identify items that might provide clues about the identity, background, and methodology of the persons responsible for the surveillance activities. Equipment serial numbers, manufacturing marks, and other identifying characteristics needed to be recorded and traced through appropriate databases to determine purchase records and ownership information that might lead to the identification of individuals or organizations involved in the project. Officer Martinez had developed expertise in evidence photography during her training and had established procedures for ensuring that all materials were documented in ways that would preserve their evidentiary value while providing clear visual information for analysis and investigation. Her attention to detail and systematic approach had been essential to maintaining the chain of custody and documentation standards necessary for potential prosecution of those responsible for the unauthorized surveillance and Mrs. Whitman's disappearance. Chief Thornfield spent the early morning hours coordinating with county and state law enforcement agencies that had been contacted to provide additional resources and expertise for the expanded investigation. The complexity of the case had grown beyond the capabilities of the small-town police department, requiring assistance with technical analysis, database searches, and coordination with academic institutions that might have connections to the research project that had been conducted without proper authorization or ethical oversight. The coordination with higher levels of law enforcement had involved sharing detailed reports and evidence that documented the scope of the surveillance activities and the circumstances of Mrs. Whitman's disappearance. The case had been classified as a kidnapping investigation with potential federal implications due to the organized nature of the activities and the possibility that the research project had involved interstate coordination or funding from federal sources. Officer James Woolworth arrived at 8 o'clock and was assigned to continue the systematic review of neighborhood patrol reports that had been prepared over the past several years. The patrol reports contained routine observations about residential areas, business districts, and other locations that officers had visited during their regular duties. While most entries documented normal activities and minor incidents, careful review had revealed subtle patterns and anomalies that had not been recognized as significant when the reports were originally prepared. Review of patrol reports had identified numerous instances where officers had observed vehicles, individuals, or activities that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now appeared to be related to the surveillance project. These observations had been recorded as part of routine documentation but had not been analyzed collectively to identify patterns that might indicate systematic surveillance or other unauthorized activities in residential neighborhoods. Officer Woolworth's familiarity with the community and his experience with previous investigations of the mysterious disturbances made him particularly well suited to recognize subtle indications of unusual activities in routine patrol reports. His ability to distinguish between normal variations in neighborhood patterns and genuinely suspicious occurrences had been valuable in identifying information that might otherwise have been overlooked during the review process. The analysis of patrol reports had also revealed the effectiveness of the surveillance project's methods for avoiding detection by routine law enforcement activities. The timing and location of documented surveillance activities had been carefully coordinated to minimize contact with police patrols, suggesting that the researchers had conducted their own observation of law enforcement patterns as part of their methodology for maintaining the secrecy of their project. The morning briefing brought together all available personnel to review progress on different aspects of the investigation and to coordinate activities for the continued search for Mrs. Whitman. Chief Thornfield had established a structured approach to information sharing that ensured all officers were informed about developments in areas outside their specific assignments while maintaining focus on individual responsibilities that contributed to the overall investigation. The briefing included discussion of leads that had been developed through analysis of the materials found at the surveillance sites, including potential connections to academic institutions and research organizations that might have been involved in funding or directing the unauthorized surveillance project. Contact with university officials and research administrators had been initiated to determine whether any legitimate research projects had been conducted in the region and whether proper approvals and ethical oversight had been obtained for studies involving human subjects. Officer Chun reported on his analysis of the financial records and equipment purchase documentation that had been discovered during the search of the lumber mill complex. The records indicated substantial funding for the surveillance project, with expenditures for sophisticated equipment, facility rental, and personnel costs that suggested a well-organized operation with significant financial backing from sources that had not yet been identified. The equipment found at the surveillance sites included cameras, recording devices, communication equipment, and computer systems that represented a considerable investment in technology designed to support long-term observation and data collection activities. Analysis of the equipment specifications and purchase records was being conducted with assistance from technical experts who could provide information about capabilities, sources, and potential users of such specialized surveillance technology. Officer Martinez provided an update on the search activities that had been conducted in areas surrounding the lumber mill complex and railway facilities. The systematic examination of buildings, wooded areas, and other potential locations where Mrs. Whitman might be held had continued throughout the previous day and would resume with expanded coverage of areas that had not yet been thoroughly investigated. The search had been complicated by the extensive nature of the abandoned industrial areas and the numerous buildings and structures that provided potential hiding places for both surveillance activities and detention facilities. Each location required careful examination to ensure that no evidence was overlooked while maintaining the safety of search personnel working in areas that might contain structural hazards or other dangers. The coordination of search activities had involved careful mapping and documentation to ensure that all areas were covered systematically without duplication of effort or gaps in coverage that might allow important locations to be missed. The search teams had established communication protocols and reporting procedures that allowed real-time coordination of activities and immediate response to any discoveries that might provide information about Mrs. Whitman's location or condition. Officer Woolworth reported on his investigation of property ownership records and rental histories for buildings and facilities that had been used by the surveillance project. The research had revealed a pattern of short-term leases and property rentals that had been arranged through intermediary organizations that obscured the identity of the actual users and the purposes for which the properties had been utilized. The property records indicated that facilities had been rented under names of consulting companies and research organizations that appeared to be front organizations created specifically to provide cover for the surveillance activities. Investigation of these organizations had revealed minimal legitimate business activity and corporate structures designed to prevent easy identification of actual ownership or control. The use of front organizations and intermediary arrangements suggested a level of sophistication and planning that indicated the surveillance project had been designed to operate for extended periods while avoiding detection by authorities or residents who might question unusual activities in their neighborhoods. The complexity of these arrangements also suggested that significant resources and expertise had been devoted to maintaining the secrecy of the research project. The afternoon brought continued analysis of the documents and materials that had been recovered from the surveillance sites, with particular attention to research protocols, data collection procedures, and analysis methods that had been used to study community dynamics and social patterns in Millhaven. The documents revealed that the surveillance project had been conducted according to detailed methodologies designed to collect comprehensive data about residential patterns, social interactions, and community responses to various stimuli and situations. The research protocols included systematic observation schedules, data collection forms, and analysis procedures that had been designed to gather information about how residents organized their daily activities, maintained social relationships, and responded to unusual events or changes in their environment. The level of detail and organization indicated that the surveillance project had been conducted according to academic research standards, despite the apparent lack of proper authorization or ethical oversight. The discovery of detailed psychological profiles and behavioral analyses of individual residents had been particularly disturbing, as these materials revealed the extent to which private lives had been observed, documented, and analyzed without consent or awareness. The profiles included information about personal relationships, daily routines, financial circumstances, and other private matters that had been obtained through unauthorized observation and investigation. Research documents also revealed that the mysterious disturbances that had been reported over the years had been part of controlled experiments designed to test community responses to unusual events and to study how information spread through social networks during periods of uncertainty or concern. The activities that residents had found troubling and invasive had been deliberately created as part of research methodology designed to generate data about social dynamics and community cohesion. Chief Thornfield spent the afternoon coordinating with federal law enforcement agencies that had been contacted to investigate potential violations of laws related to surveillance activities, research conducted without proper authorization, and the apparent kidnapping of Mrs. Whitman. The federal agencies had expertise in investigating complex criminal organizations and research-related crimes that exceeded the capabilities of local law enforcement. The involvement of federal agencies had brought additional resources and investigative techniques that would be necessary to fully understand the scope of the surveillance project and to identify all individuals and organizations responsible for the unauthorized research activities. The coordination between different levels of law enforcement required careful attention to jurisdictional issues and information sharing protocols that would ensure effective investigation while maintaining the integrity of evidence and procedures. The federal investigation had begun with analysis of the financial records and organizational documents that had been discovered during the search of surveillance facilities. The complexity of the funding arrangements and corporate structures suggested that the research project might have involved violations of federal laws related to research oversight, human subjects protection, and financial reporting requirements for organizations receiving federal funding or tax-exempt status. As the afternoon progressed, the investigation team received the first significant breakthrough in identifying the academic institution that appeared to be connected to the surveillance project. Analysis of equipment serial numbers and purchase records had revealed connections to a university research program that had been conducting studies of social dynamics in small communities throughout the region. The university connection provided specific leads for investigating the authorization and oversight of the research project, including identification of faculty members, graduate students, and research staff who might have been involved in the surveillance activities. Contact with university officials would be necessary to determine whether the surveillance project had been conducted with proper approval and ethical oversight, or whether it represented unauthorized research that violated institutional policies and federal regulations. The identification of the academic connection also provided potential leads for determining Mrs. Whitman's location, as university facilities and affiliated properties might be used for research activities that required temporary detention or containment of individuals whose activities threatened to compromise ongoing studies. The investigation would need to expand to include examination of university properties and facilities that might be connected to the research project. The evening briefing brought together all available personnel to review the day's progress and to establish priorities for the continued investigation and search activities. The identification of the university connection had provided new directions for investigation, while highlighting the complexity and potential scope of the unauthorized research project that had been conducted in Millhaven. Chief Thornfield emphasized the continued priority of locating Mrs. Whitman and ensuring her safety, while acknowledging that the investigation had revealed activities that would require extensive additional work to fully understand and address. The patient, methodical approach that had characterized the investigation from its beginning would need to continue as the scope of the case expanded to include federal agencies and academic institutions. Systematic documentation and analysis that had been conducted throughout the investigation had provided the foundation for understanding the complex activities that had been occurring in their community for many years. The careful attention to detail and thorough examination of evidence that characterized professional police work had been essential to recognizing patterns and connections that had revealed the true nature of the surveillance project. Officer Chun concluded the day by updating all documentation and evidence catalogs to reflect the new information that had been discovered and the leads that had been developed for continued investigation. The comprehensive records that had been maintained throughout the case would be essential for coordination with federal agencies and for ensuring that all aspects of the complex investigation were properly documented and preserved. The quiet town of Millhaven had discovered that the patient work of careful investigation could reveal activities and connections that had remained hidden despite occurring in their community for many years. The methodical approach of professional law enforcement had been necessary to understand the scope and complexity of unauthorized research that had violated the privacy and trust that residents had taken for granted throughout their lives in what they had believed to be a secure and peaceful community. Sunday morning brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Millhaven as word of the investigation spread quietly through the community, carried by the informal networks of conversation and concern that connected neighbors, shopkeepers, and longtime residents who had witnessed decades of change in their peaceful town. The investigation had reached a point where discretion could no longer contain all aspects of the search for Mrs. Florence Whitman, and the involvement of federal agencies had begun to attract the kind of attention that inevitably accompanied serious law enforcement activities in small communities. Robert Miller opened his grocery store at 7 o'clock, following the Sunday schedule that had been maintained for years to serve residents who needed essential items before the beginning of the week's activities. The store's quiet Sunday atmosphere provided an environment where conversations developed more naturally than during the busier weekdays, and Robert had learned to recognize when community concerns required the kind of listening and support that local business owners could provide during periods of uncertainty or change. The morning's first customers included several residents who had been directly or indirectly affected by the investigation, and their conversations revealed the growing awareness that the mysterious disturbances of recent weeks were part of something larger and more concerning than simple trespassing or vandalism. The presence of additional law enforcement personnel and the expanded search activities had created a sense of unease that contrasted sharply with the security and predictability that had always characterized life in Millhaven. Mrs. Patricia Collins, who worked the Sunday morning shift at Miller's Grocery, had lived in the community for 26 years and possessed the kind of comprehensive knowledge of family relationships and local history that made her a valuable source of information about changes in neighborhood patterns and unusual activities. Her position at the checkout counter provided opportunities for brief conversations with residents from throughout the town, creating an informal network of information that complemented the official channels through which news and concerns were communicated. Patricia had noticed an increase in conversations about security concerns, unusual vehicles observed in residential neighborhoods, and questions about the expanded police activities that had been visible throughout the weekend. The topics that emerged during casual conversations reflected growing awareness that recent events were more serious than the minor incidents that typically occupied community attention during normal periods. The discussion at Miller's Grocery that morning included recollections of previous incidents that residents were beginning to recognize as potentially related to the current investigation. Mrs. Dorothy Martinez mentioned that she had observed unfamiliar vehicles parked in her neighborhood during several evenings over the past months, but had not reported these observations because the vehicles had not appeared to present any immediate threat or cause for concern. Mr. Kenneth Williams described occasions when he had noticed individuals walking through residential areas at unusual times, including early morning hours when most residents would not typically be outside their homes. The individuals had appeared to be conducting some form of systematic activity rather than simply taking recreational walks, but their behavior had not seemed threatening enough to warrant contact with law enforcement. These recollections, shared in the comfortable environment of the grocery store where neighbors had gathered for decades to discuss community concerns, provided additional perspective on the scope of surveillance activities that had been conducted throughout Millhaven over extended periods. The casual observations of residents going about their daily routines had captured evidence of the research project's activities, though the significance of these observations had not been recognized until the current Investigation had provided context for understanding their meaning. William Peterson, the owner of Peterson's Hardware, arrived at his store at 8 o'clock and spent the early morning hours preparing for the day's business while reflecting on conversations he had had with customers throughout the previous week. The hardware store served as another informal gathering place where residents discussed practical concerns related to home maintenance, seasonal preparations, and community activities that brought neighbors together for shared projects and mutual assistance. The conversations at Peterson's Hardware during the past week had included increased interest in security equipment, locks, lighting systems, and other items that residents were purchasing to enhance their sense of safety in response to reports of mysterious activities in their neighborhoods. William had noted the change in purchasing patterns and had recognized that community concerns were influencing decisions about home security measures that had not previously been considered necessary in their peaceful town. William's long experience as a business owner in Millhaven had provided him with detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns, family traditions, and community rhythms that made it possible to recognize when changes in customer behavior reflected broader concerns or developments affecting the town. His observations about increased interest in security measures had been one of the early indicators that recent events were having a more significant impact on community attitudes than might have been apparent from official reports. The hardware store's role as a source of practical solutions for home and property maintenance had made William a frequent contact for residents seeking advice about addressing security concerns or investigating unusual activities on their properties. His technical knowledge and familiarity with various products had enabled him to provide guidance about appropriate measures for different situations while avoiding recommendations that might create unnecessary anxiety or expense. Several customers had described unusual sounds, disturbed vegetation, and other signs of unauthorized activity on their properties, seeking advice about lights, alarms, or other measures that might provide better security or documentation of future incidents. William's recommendations had been guided by practical considerations and by his understanding that effective security measures needed to be balanced with maintaining the open and trusting atmosphere that had always characterized neighborhood relationships in Millhaven. The Millhaven Diner served as perhaps the most important informal communication center in the town, where residents from different neighborhoods and backgrounds encountered each other during meals and coffee breaks that provided opportunities for sharing information and discussing concerns that affected the broader community. Margaret Henley, who managed the morning shift, had developed skill at facilitating conversations that allowed residents to express concerns while maintaining the positive atmosphere that made the diner a welcoming place for people seeking social connection. The Sunday morning crowd at the diner included many of the residents who had been most directly affected by the mysterious incidents and the ongoing investigation. The conversations that developed over breakfast and coffee provided opportunities for sharing experiences and observations that had not been communicated through official channels but were important for understanding the full impact of surveillance activities on community life. Eleanor Vasquez joined Dorothy Keller and Harold Finch for breakfast, creating an opportunity for the three neighbors who had reported the initial disturbances to compare their experiences and discuss the developments that had transformed their reports from isolated incidents into evidence of systematic surveillance that had been conducted throughout their neighborhood for years. Their conversation revealed details and perspectives that complemented the official investigation while providing emotional support for residents who had been personally affected by the violation of their privacy and security. The discussion among the three neighbors included recollections of subtle changes in their neighborhood over past years that they were beginning to recognize as potentially related to the surveillance activities. These changes had included variations in pedestrian traffic, unfamiliar vehicles observed during early morning or late evening hours, and small disturbances to landscaping or property arrangements that had seemed insignificant when they occurred. but now appeared to be evidence of systematic observation and documentation. Robert Chun, the retired postal worker who had first reported Mrs. Whitman's absence, joined the conversation to share his observations about changes in neighborhood patterns and his growing concern about the safety implications of surveillance, activities that had apparently been conducted without the knowledge or consent of residents. His background in postal service and his systematic approach to observation had provided him with detailed knowledge of normal patterns that made it possible to recognize signs of unusual activities. The conversation at the diner also included discussion of the search activities that had been conducted throughout the weekend and the involvement of additional law enforcement personnel who had brought resources and expertise that were not typically required for addressing local incidents. The visible expansion of the investigation had created awareness that Mrs. Whitman's disappearance was connected to activities that extended beyond simple trespassing or vandalism. Linda Patterson, the head librarian, joined the morning gathering to share information about Mrs. Whitman's research activities and to discuss the library's cooperation with law enforcement personnel who had been investigating the materials that Florence had been examining during her visits to the local history collection. The library's records had provided important information about the focus of Florence's research and had helped establish connections between her disappearance and the surveillance activities that had been discovered in residential neighborhoods. The library's role as a repository for historical information and community records had made it an important resource for the investigation, as many of the documents and materials that Florence had been studying were related to property histories, neighborhood development, and other aspects of local history that had been relevant to understanding the surveillance project. Linda's knowledge of the collection and her familiarity with Florence's research interests had been valuable for identifying materials that might provide additional insights into the activities that had led to her disappearance. The morning conversations at various locations throughout Millhaven revealed the extent to which the investigation had begun to affect community attitudes and daily routines, as residents adjusted their activities in response to concerns about surveillance and security that had not previously been part of their daily considerations. The changes were subtle but significant, reflecting the impact of learning that their private lives had been observed and documented without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Patricia Morrison, Mrs. Whitman's physician, stopped by the diner during her morning rounds to check on elderly patients whose medical needs required weekend attention. Her presence provided an opportunity for residents to discuss health-related concerns that might have been affected by stress and anxiety related to the investigation and the broader security issues that had been revealed through the search for Florence. Dr. Morrison's long experience providing medical care in Millhaven had made her familiar with the ways that community concerns could affect individual health and well-being, particularly among elderly residents who might be more vulnerable to stress and anxiety related to changes in their familiar environment. Her observations about increased requests for sleep aids, anxiety medications, and other treatments related to stress had provided additional evidence of the investigation's impact on community welfare. The medical perspective on the investigation's impact included recognition that privacy violations and surveillance activities could have long-term effects on mental health and community trust that would require attention even after the immediate security concerns had been resolved. The therapeutic relationship between healthcare providers and patients had been affected by questions about confidentiality and security that had not previously been relevant in a small town where professional relationships were based on long-standing trust and familiarity. Father Michael O'Brien from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church encountered several parishioners during his morning visits to hospitalized and homebound members of his congregation, providing opportunities for conversations about the spiritual and emotional challenges that arose when community members faced situations that challenged their security and trust. The pastoral care responsibilities that were part of his ministry had been expanded to include counseling and support related to the investigation and its implications for community life. the church's role as a source of comfort and stability during periods of uncertainty had become more important as residents sought ways to process their concerns and maintain hope during the investigation of activities that had violated fundamental assumptions about privacy and security in their community. The spiritual resources provided through religious institutions had complemented the practical support offered by law enforcement and community organizations. The conversations that developed in various locations throughout Millhaven during the morning hours revealed the complex ways that the investigation was affecting different aspects of community life, from practical concerns about home security to deeper questions about trust, privacy, and the social relationships that had provided stability and meaning for residents throughout their years of life in the town. As the morning progressed, law enforcement personnel continued their systematic investigation while maintaining awareness of the broader community impact that required careful attention to communication and public information activities. Balance between operational security for the investigation and community needs for information and reassurance required ongoing attention to ensure that residents could maintain their daily routines while cooperating with activities designed to resolve the security concerns that had been revealed. The expanded search for Mrs. Whitman continued with systematic examination of areas that had not yet been thoroughly investigated, including additional industrial facilities, transportation infrastructure, and rural areas surrounding the town, where surveillance activities might have been conducted or where temporary facilities might have been established to support research operations that required isolation from casual observation. Officer Martinez coordinated with search teams that included volunteers from the community who had organized to assist with activities that did not require specialized law enforcement training but could contribute to the comprehensive coverage of areas where Mrs. Whitman might be located. The volunteer participation had provided additional resources while demonstrating community commitment to resolving the situation and ensuring the safety of a valued community member. Chief Thornfield spent the morning coordinating with federal agencies that had assumed primary responsibility for investigating the academic research project that appeared to be connected to the surveillance activities and Mrs. Whitman's disappearance. The federal investigation had expanded to include examination of university facilities, research records, and personnel who might have been involved in unauthorized surveillance activities that violated federal laws related to human subjects research and privacy protection. The coordination between local and federal law enforcement had required careful attention to maintaining the community focus of the investigation while ensuring that broader legal and regulatory issues were addressed through appropriate channels. The residents of Millhaven needed to see that their immediate concerns about safety and security were being addressed while understanding that the full resolution of the situation would require investigation of complex issues that extended beyond local jurisdiction. The afternoon brought additional developments as federal investigators began to identify specific individuals and organizations that appeared to be connected to the surveillance project, providing leads that might help locate Mrs. Whitman and determine the full scope of activities that had been conducted in Millhaven over extended periods. The investigation was entering a phase where specific actions could be taken to address the immediate safety concerns while developing understanding of the broader implications for community welfare and security. The shopkeepers, workers, and residents who formed the daily fabric of life in Millhaven had provided essential information and support that complemented the technical investigation conducted by law enforcement personnel. Their observations, memories, and willingness to share information had been crucial for understanding how surveillance activities had been integrated into the normal patterns of community life over many years without detection or recognition by those whose lives had been observed and documented. As the day continued, the investigation remained focused on the primary objective of locating Mrs. Whitman and ensuring her safety. while addressing the broader community needs for information, security, and restoration of the trust and privacy that had been violated by unauthorized research activities conducted without consent or knowledge of those affected. The first frost of the season had touched the gardens and lawns of Millhaven during the early hours of Monday morning, leaving delicate patterns of ice crystals on windows and creating the silvery coating on grass and fallen leaves that marked the transition from autumn into the approach of winter. The seasonal change brought both beauty and a sense of urgency to the ongoing investigation, as law enforcement personnel recognized that weather conditions would soon make outdoor search activities more challenging and might affect the preservation of evidence that remained to be discovered. Chief Thornfield arrived at the station before dawn to find a package waiting on her desk, delivered by overnight courier from the federal agents who had been investigating the academic connections to the surveillance project that had been conducted in Millhaven. The package contained copies of documents and correspondence that had been recovered from university offices and research facilities, providing the first comprehensive picture of how the unauthorized surveillance activities had been organized, funded, and conducted over the years that residents had been unknowingly observed and studied. The documents revealed that the surveillance project had been conducted under the direction of Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a professor of sociology at the State University, whose research interests focused on social dynamics in small communities and the ways that isolated populations responded to various forms of external stimuli and internal disruption. Dr. Pemberton had apparently convinced university administrators that his research qualified as observational study that did not require informed consent from subjects who were being observed in public settings. However, the correspondence between Dr. Pemberton and his research assistants revealed that the project had extended far beyond simple observation of public activities to include systematic surveillance of private residences, collection of personal information about individual residents, and deliberate creation of mysterious events designed to test community responses to unusual situations. The scope of the project had clearly exceeded the boundaries of legitimate research and had violated numerous ethical guidelines related to human subjects research. The letters and email communications that had been recovered from Dr. Pemberton's office files showed that he had been aware that his research methods were ethically questionable and potentially illegal, but had justified the activities as necessary to collect data that could not be obtained through conventional research approaches. His correspondence with graduate students and research assistants had emphasized the importance of maintaining secrecy and avoiding detection by local authorities or community members who might interfere with data collection activities. Among the most significant documents in the federal package were detailed research protocols that described the systematic approach that had been used to select communities for study, identify individual residents for particular attention, and design experimental stimuli that would generate measurable responses from subjects who were unaware that they were participating in research activities. The protocols revealed the sophisticated planning and organization that had been necessary to conduct surveillance activities over extended periods without detection. The research files included comprehensive profiles of Millhaven residents that had been compiled through years of systematic observation and data collection. The profiles contained detailed information about daily routines, social relationships, financial circumstances, health concerns, family histories, and other personal matters that had been obtained through unauthorized surveillance and investigation of private records and communications. Particular concern were the profiles that had been developed for Mrs. Florence Whitman, Eleanor Vasquez, Harold Finch, Dorothy Keller, and other residents who had been identified as key subjects for intensive study due to their roles in community social networks or their potential to serve as opinion leaders during periods of uncertainty or change. These individuals had been subjected to particularly detailed surveillance that had included monitoring of their private communications, financial records, and personal relationships. Correspondence between Dr. Pemberton and his research team revealed that Mrs. Whitman had been identified several months earlier as a potential threat to the continued secrecy of the research project due to her background in historical research and her systematic approach to investigating unusual activities in her neighborhood. The research team had been monitoring her library activities and had recognized that her investigation of property records and historical documents was leading her toward discovery of patterns that could expose the surveillance project. The final communications in the recovered files indicated that Dr. Pemberton had authorized what he described as temporary containment of Mrs. Whitman to prevent her from compromising the research project before data collection could be completed and results could be analyzed and published. The authorization for her detention had been presented as a necessary measure to protect the integrity of research that had required years of careful planning and substantial financial investment. Chief Thornfield immediately contacted the federal agents who had provided the documents to request information about Dr. Pemberton's current location and the status of efforts to locate the facilities where Mrs. Whitman might be held by members of his research team. The federal investigation had expanded to include examination of all properties and facilities that might be connected to the research project, including university-owned buildings, rented facilities, and private properties that might have been used to support surveillance and detention activities. The morning briefing at the Millhaven Police Department included discussion of the new information that had been revealed through the federal investigation. Though specific details were withheld to protect the integrity of ongoing activities designed to locate Mrs. Whitman and apprehend those responsible for her detention. The officers were informed that significant progress had been made in identifying the individuals and organizations responsible for the surveillance activities, and that specific actions were being taken to address the immediate safety concerns. Officer Chun was assigned to continue reviewing local records and correspondence that might provide additional information about the research project's activities in Millhaven, including any contacts with local officials, business owners, or residents that might have been necessary to establish surveillance operations or gather information about community activities and social patterns. The review of local records included examination of City Hall files, business licenses, property rental agreements, and other official documents that might reveal connections to the research project or its personnel. The systematic examination of routine administrative records had proven valuable for identifying patterns and connections that might not be apparent from investigation of obvious surveillance activities and evidence. Officer Martinez was tasked with coordinating continued search activities while maintaining awareness of weather conditions that were forecast to include the possibility of snow flurries and freezing temperatures that could affect both outdoor search operations and the preservation of evidence that had not yet been discovered. The seasonal changes required modifications to search procedures and equipment to ensure the safety of personnel while maintaining the thoroughness necessary to locate Mrs. Whitman. The search activities had been expanded to include areas that had not been systematically examined during the previous week's operations, including rural properties surrounding Millhaven, abandoned agricultural buildings, and seasonal facilities that might have been available for temporary use by researchers who needed isolation and concealment for activities that could not be conducted in more visible locations. Officer Woolworth continued his investigation of historical patterns and connections that might provide insight into the long-term development of the surveillance project and the selection of Millhaven as a research site. His review of community records and newspaper archives had revealed subtle references to activities and events that appeared to be connected to the research project, including mentions of visiting researchers, academic conferences, and consultant activities that had occurred during periods when surveillance activities were particularly intense. The historical investigation had also revealed that Millhaven had been selected as a research site, partly because of its stability and the availability of detailed records about community development, social relationships, and demographic patterns that provided baseline information against which experimental effects could be measured. The town's peaceful character and the trusting nature of resident relationships had made it an ideal location for conducting surveillance without arousing suspicion or resistance. The afternoon brought a significant development when federal agents conducting surveillance of university facilities observed Dr. Pemberton and several associates arriving at a research station located in a rural area approximately 30 miles from Millhaven. The facility appeared to be a legitimate field research station that had been established to support various environmental and social science projects, but surveillance indicated that it was currently being used for activities that were not consistent with its official purposes. The federal agents had established observation of the research station while coordinating with local law enforcement to develop plans for investigating the facility and determining whether Mrs. Whitman was being held there or at other locations that might be connected to the research project. The coordination between federal and local agencies was essential to ensure that any enforcement actions would be conducted safely while preserving evidence and protecting the welfare of anyone who might be held against their will. Chief Thornfield was briefed on the surveillance of the research station and was informed that plans were being developed for coordinated law enforcement actions that would address both the immediate concern for Mrs. Whitman's safety and the broader investigation of unauthorized research activities that had violated federal laws related to human subjects research and privacy protection. The timing of these actions would depend on continued surveillance and intelligence gathering that would provide information about the number of people at the facility and the cost of security measures that had been implemented. The investigation of the research station was complicated by its legitimate status as a university facility that was normally used for authorized research activities, requiring careful attention to legal requirements related to search warrants and coordination with university officials who might not be aware of the unauthorized activities that had been conducted using their facilities and resources. While federal agents maintained surveillance of the research station, local law enforcement continued activities designed to gather additional information about the surveillance project and its impact on Millhaven residents. The investigation had revealed extensive documentation of community activities and personal information that would need to be secured and reviewed to determine the full scope of privacy violations that had occurred over years of unauthorized observation and data collection. The review of research documents had revealed that the project had included systematic collection of personal correspondence, financial records, medical information, and other private materials that had been obtained through unauthorized access to mail delivery, electronic communications, and various databases that contained confidential information about residents. The methods used to collect this information had involved numerous violations of state and federal laws related to privacy protection and unauthorized surveillance. The town hall records that Officer Chun had been examining included references to inquiries about property records, zoning regulations, and municipal services that appeared to have been made by individuals associated with the research project. These inquiries had been presented as routine requests for information, but they had been part of systematic efforts to gather detailed information about community infrastructure and administrative procedures that would be necessary to conduct surveillance activities without detection. The correspondence files maintained by various city departments contained letters and email messages that appeared to be from legitimate research organizations requesting information about community demographics, social services, and economic development activities. However, analysis of these communications revealed that they were part of systematic data collection efforts that had been designed to compile comprehensive profiles of Millhaven and its residents for use in research activities that had never been properly authorized or disclosed. The seasonal changes that were affecting the landscape around Millhaven had also begun to reveal evidence that had been concealed by summer vegetation and autumn foliage. The loss of leaves from deciduous trees and the death of annual plants had exposed surveillance equipment, temporary structures, and storage locations that had been hidden during earlier phases of the investigation. The changing seasons had inadvertently assisted law enforcement efforts by making visible signs of activities that had been carefully concealed during periods when vegetation provided natural camouflage. The discovery of additional surveillance equipment and temporary facilities had provided further evidence of the scope and sophistication of the research project, while revealing the extensive infrastructure that had been necessary to support years of systematic observation and data collection. The equipment included communication devices, recording systems, and data storage facilities that had been positioned throughout the area to support comprehensive surveillance of residential neighborhoods and community activities. As the afternoon progressed, coordination between federal and local law enforcement agencies resulted in the development of specific plans for investigating the research station where Dr. Pemberton and his associates had been observed. The plans included provisions for ensuring Mrs. Whitman's safety while gathering evidence of unauthorized research activities and apprehending those responsible for her detention and the broader violations of privacy and research ethics that had been conducted in Millhaven. The investigation had reached a critical phase where years of patient observation and systematic data collection by unauthorized researchers would be confronted by the coordinated response of legitimate law enforcement agencies working to protect community welfare and restore the privacy and security that had been violated through academic research that had exceeded ethical and legal boundaries. The letters, notes, and official documents that had been discovered through the investigation provided comprehensive evidence of activities that had transformed Millhaven from a peaceful community into an unwilling subject of experimental research that had violated fundamental principles of informed consent and privacy protection. The seasonal changes that were affecting the physical landscape had also marked a transition from secret surveillance to official investigation and the beginning of accountability for those who had conducted unauthorized research at the expense of community trust and individual privacy. Chief Thornfield concluded the day by coordinating with federal agents who were finalizing preparations for law enforcement actions that would address the immediate concerns about Mrs. Whitman's welfare while beginning the complex process of investigating and prosecuting violations that had occurred over many years of systematic surveillance and unauthorized research. The peaceful town of Millhaven would soon learn whether their missing neighbor could be safely recovered and whether those responsible for violating their privacy and security would be held accountable for activities that had transformed their community into an unwilling laboratory for academic research that had crossed ethical and legal boundaries in pursuit of data. A Bootsmall town's social dynamics. The morning of Tuesday, October 23rd, dawned clear and cold over the rural research station where federal agents had maintained careful surveillance throughout the night, monitoring the activities of Dr. Marcus Pemberton and his research associates while coordinating the law enforcement response that would address both the immediate concern for Mrs. Florence Whitman's safety and the broader investigation of unauthorized surveillance activities that had violated the privacy and trust of Millhaven residents for many years. The research station occupied a cluster of buildings that had been constructed in the 1980s to support legitimate environmental and social science research projects conducted by the State University. The facility was located in a wooded area that provided natural isolation from casual observation while offering the infrastructure and utilities necessary to support extended research activities that required temporary residence for faculty and students working on projects that could not be conducted from traditional campus facilities. Federal agent Sarah Harrison, who had been assigned to coordinate the law enforcement response, had spent the early morning hours reviewing surveillance reports and intelligence information that had been gathered through observation of the research station and investigation of Dr. Pemberton's research activities. The surveillance had confirmed that Mrs. Whitman was being held at the facility and had identified the specific building where she appeared to be confined, along with information about security measures and personnel that would need to be addressed during the enforcement operation. The coordination between federal agents and local law enforcement personnel had been designed to ensure that the operation would be conducted with appropriate attention to Mrs. Whitman's safety while gathering evidence of the unauthorized research activities and apprehending those responsible for her detention and the broader violations that had been conducted in Millhaven. Chief Thornfield and Officer Martinez had been designated to participate in the operation as representatives of the community that had been affected by the surveillance project. The approach to the research station was planned to minimize the possibility of resistance or attempts to destroy evidence while ensuring that Mrs. Whitman could be safely removed from confinement and provided with immediate medical attention if necessary. The surveillance had indicated that she appeared to be in reasonable health, but had been held against her will for nearly a week, during which time she had been questioned about her research activities and her knowledge of the surveillance project that had been conducted in her community. At 7:30 in the morning, federal agents initiated the enforcement operation with simultaneous approaches to all buildings at the research station, supported by local law enforcement personnel who had been briefed on the layout of the facility and the specific objectives of the operation. The coordination was executed with the precision that had been developed through careful planning and extensive experience with similar operations involving the investigation and resolution of complex criminal activities. Dr. Pemberton and 3 graduate students who had been assisting with the surveillance project were taken into custody without resistance, though the professor attempted to argue that his research activities had been conducted for legitimate academic purposes and that Mrs. Whitman's detention had been necessary to protect the integrity of important social science research. His arguments were dismissed by federal agents who had reviewed the extensive documentation of unauthorized surveillance and privacy violations that clearly exceeded any reasonable interpretation of legitimate research methodology. Mrs. Whitman was found in a small room that had been converted into temporary living quarters, where she had been provided with basic necessities, but had been prevented from communicating with anyone outside the research station or leaving the facility voluntarily. Her condition appeared to be generally good, despite the stress of her involuntary confinement, though she was immediately provided with medical evaluation and support to address any health concerns that might have resulted from her detention. The reunion between Mrs. Whitman and the law enforcement personnel who had been searching for her throughout the previous week was marked by quiet relief rather than dramatic celebration, as everyone recognized that her safe recovery represented only the beginning of a complex process of addressing the broader implications of the unauthorized surveillance that had been conducted in Millhaven. Her first questions concerned the welfare of her neighbors and friends who had been subjects of the research project, demonstrating the community concern that had motivated her own investigation of the mysterious activities. Mrs. Whitman's account of her detention revealed that Dr. Pemberton had initially attempted to convince her that she was participating in important research that would contribute to understanding of social dynamics in small communities. When she had refused to cooperate and had demanded to be released, she had been informed that her detention would continue until the research project could be completed and the data could be analyzed and published in ways that would protect the identity of the community and individuals who had been studied. During her confinement, Mrs. Whitman had been questioned extensively about her research activities at the library and her investigation of property records and historical documents that had led her to recognize patterns suggesting systematic surveillance of residential neighborhoods. Her responses had confirmed Dr. Pemberton's assessment that her investigation posed a threat to the continued secrecy of the research project. Though her detention had obviously been illegal, regardless of the academic motivations that had been used to justify the action. The search of the research station revealed extensive documentation of the surveillance project, including detailed records of observations that had been conducted in Millhaven over a period of nearly 15 years. The records included photographs, audio recordings, video surveillance, and written reports that documented the daily activities, social relationships, and personal circumstances of hundreds of residents who had been unknowingly subjected to systematic observation and analysis. The scope of the surveillance documentation was remarkable in its comprehensiveness and disturbing in its violation of privacy expectations that residents had taken for granted throughout their lives in what they had believed to be a secure and peaceful community. The research files contained information about family relationships, financial circumstances, health concerns, personal conflicts, and other private matters that had been obtained through unauthorized observation and investigation of confidential records and communications. Among the most significant discoveries at the research station were the experimental protocols that had been used to create the mysterious disturbances and unusual events that had been reported by residents over the years. The protocols revealed that these incidents had been carefully designed to test community responses to various forms of social stress and uncertainty, with detailed measurement of how information spread through social networks and how residents organized collective responses to perceived threats or unusual circumstances. The mysterious footsteps that had been reported by Eleanor Vasquez, Harold Finch, and Dorothy Keller had been part of controlled experiments designed to test neighborhood communication patterns and to measure the effectiveness of different approaches to creating low-level anxiety that could be sustained over extended periods without causing obvious harm or generating complaints that would attract law enforcement attention. The experiments had been conducted with sophisticated understanding of psychological principles and social dynamics. The research station also contained equipment and facilities that had been used to support the surveillance activities conducted in Millhaven, including communication systems that had been used to coordinate observations, data storage systems that had been used to organize and analyze collected information, and transportation resources that had been used to move personnel and equipment between the research station and surveillance locations in residential neighborhoods. The federal agents who conducted the search of the research station worked systematically to catalog and preserve all materials that would be necessary for prosecuting those responsible for the unauthorized surveillance and for providing a comprehensive accounting of the privacy violations that had been conducted over many years. The documentation requirements for complex criminal cases involving multiple defendants and extensive evidence required careful attention to chain of custody procedures and proper handling of sensitive materials. Chief Thornfield and Officer Martinez assisted with the evidence collection activities while maintaining focus on gathering information that would be necessary for addressing community concerns and providing residents of Millhaven with comprehensive understanding of the surveillance activities that had been conducted in their neighborhoods. The local law enforcement perspective was important for ensuring that community needs were considered alongside the federal prosecution requirements. Mrs. Whitman was transported to Millhaven General Hospital for medical evaluation and observation, though her physical condition appeared to be good despite the stress of her detention. Her mental state reflected both relief at being rescued and concern about the broader implications of learning that her community had been subjected to systematic surveillance for many years, without the knowledge or consent of those whose private lives had been observed and documented. The medical evaluation revealed no serious health problems resulting from Mrs. Whitman's detention, though she was advised to remain under observation for 24 hours to ensure that delayed reactions to stress or other complications did not develop. Her primary concerns during the medical evaluation focused on returning to her home and resuming her normal activities, while contributing to whatever additional Investigation might be necessary to understand the full scope of the surveillance project. The news of Mrs. Whitman's safe recovery spread quickly through Millhaven, carried by the informal communication networks that had been studied and documented by the research project, but that now served the positive purpose of reassuring residents that their missing neighbor had been found and was receiving appropriate care and support. The relief that accompanied news of her rescue was tempered by growing awareness of the extent to which their private lives had been violated through unauthorized surveillance. The afternoon brought the beginning of a complex process of notification and explanation that would be necessary to inform Millhaven residents about the surveillance activities that had been conducted in their community and the legal proceedings that would be initiated to prosecute those responsible for the unauthorized research. The notification process required careful attention to privacy concerns and legal requirements while providing residents with information they needed to understand what had been done to their community. Chief Thornfield coordinated with federal agents and community leaders to develop an approach to public information that would provide residents with comprehensive understanding of the surveillance project while protecting the integrity of ongoing legal proceedings and respecting the privacy of individuals whose personal information had been collected through unauthorized observation. The balance between transparency and legal requirements required careful attention to multiple considerations. The first community meeting to address the surveillance project was scheduled for the following evening at the high school auditorium, providing a venue large enough to accommodate residents who wanted to learn about the activities that had been conducted in their neighborhoods and the measures that were being taken to address the privacy violations and security concerns that had been revealed through the investigation. Dr. Pemberton and his research associates were transported to federal facilities where they would be held pending formal charges related to unauthorized surveillance, violation of research ethics regulations, kidnapping, and other crimes that had been committed during the course of their research activities. The federal prosecutors who would be handling the case had indicated that the charges would be comprehensive and would address both the immediate crimes related to Mrs. Whitman's detention and the broader pattern of privacy violations that had been conducted over many years. The legal proceedings that would follow from the investigation were expected to be complex and lengthy, involving not only criminal prosecution of those directly responsible for the surveillance activities, but also civil litigation that would address the damages suffered by residents whose privacy had been violated and whose personal information had been collected and analyzed without their consent. The university that had employed Dr. Pemberton would also face investigation of its oversight responsibilities and potential liability for the unauthorized research conducted by its faculty. As evening approached, Mrs. Whitman was released from the hospital and returned to her home on Cedar Avenue, where she was greeted by neighbors and friends who had been concerned about her welfare throughout the week of her absence. The familiar surroundings of her house and garden provided comfort and stability after the disorienting experience of detention at the research station, though she recognized that the process of addressing the broader implications of the surveillance project would require considerable time and community effort. The investigation that had begun with reports of mysterious footsteps in residential neighborhoods had revealed activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about privacy, security, and trust that had formed the foundation of community life in Millhaven. The resolution of the immediate crisis through Mrs. Whitman's safe recovery marked the beginning of a longer process of healing and restoration that would be necessary to address the impacts of learning that their peaceful community had been subjected to systematic observation and experimental manipulation for academic purposes. The seasonal changes that had marked the progression of the investigation from early autumn through the approach of winter had also witnessed the transformation of Millhaven from a community that took privacy and security for granted to one that had learned the importance of vigilance and the value of the social connections that had enabled residents to recognize when unusual activities required attention and investigation. The mystery that had disrupted their peaceful routines had ultimately demonstrated the strength of community bonds and the effectiveness of cooperation between residents and law enforcement in addressing threats to community welfare. Chief Thornfield concluded the day by reviewing the comprehensive documentation that had been developed throughout the investigation, recognizing that the case would serve as an important example of how unauthorized research activities could be detected and addressed through careful observation, systematic investigation, and appropriate coordination between local and federal law enforcement agencies. The successful resolution of the case had protected community welfare while establishing legal precedents that would help prevent similar violations in other communities that might be targeted for unauthorized surveillance and experimental research. The lights that began to appear in windows throughout Millhaven as darkness settled over the town represented not only the return to normal evening routines, but also the restoration of security and privacy that residents had feared might be permanently compromised by the discovery that their community had been subjected to systematic surveillance. Mrs. Whitman's safe return had provided closure to the immediate crisis while beginning the longer process of healing and restoration that would be necessary to fully address the impacts of the unauthorized research that had violated their trust and privacy for so many years.